My billionaire husband looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was absolutely nothing without him. He said I owed him every breath I took in his penthouse. He smiled, completely unaware that while he was insulting me, I had already initiated a sequence of events that would dismantle his entire empire by morning. He would be on his knees begging before the sun came up, but by then it would be far too late. The heavy oak doors of the VIP cloakroom at the Plaza Hotel muffled the string quartet playing in the main ballroom. I stood with my back pressed against the cold marble wall, my hands trembling as I stared at the man I had loved for 6 years. Preston paced the small room like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. His tuxedo was immaculate, his hair perfectly styled, and his eyes were completely devoid of the warmth I used to believe existed. He stopped pacing and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He did not hand it to me. He tossed it. The box hit my chest and clattered onto the floor, springing open to reveal a gaudy, overly large cubic zirconia pendant resting on cheap satin. It looked like a trinket from a discount mall. "Pick it up," he commanded, adjusting his diamond cufflinks. "Wear it. The press wants a picture of the happy couple before the main event, and you need to look the part of a grateful wife." I stared at the fake stone, my throat tightening. My neck felt bare. Just 10 minutes ago, I had opened the hotel safe to retrieve the single most precious thing I owned. My late grandmother had left me a $2 million vintage diamond choker. It was a family heirloom, a piece of my history that I had guarded fiercely. It was gone from the safe, and now I knew exactly where it was. Just beyond the cloakroom doors, standing under the crystal chandeliers and sipping expensive champagne, was Madison. She was Prestonia's vice president of acquisitions. She was also the woman who had spent the last hour flaunting my grandmother's diamonds around her neck, letting every billionaire and socialite in Manhattan admire the stolen jewels. When I had confronted Preston about it pulling him into this private room, I had expected an apology. I had expected him to say it was a terrible mistake. Instead, he threw a piece of cheap glass at me. "Are you insane?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You gave my grandmother's choker to Madison. That is my property." Preston laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Nothing is your property, Elena. You own nothing. You produce nothing. You sit in my penthouse, you spend my money, and you arrange flowers for my dinner parties. Madison closed a $1 billion merger today. She earned a reward. You earned this conversation." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slamming them onto the vanity counter. He tapped the top page with his index finger. "This is a post-nuptial agreement," he stated plainly. "You are going to sign it right now. It states that in the event of a divorce, you walk away with $50,000 and the clothes on your back. You forfeit all rights to the penthouse, all claims to my company, and all access to the joint accounts." I stared at the thick stack of paper. The sheer audacity of his demand sent a shockwave of cold adrenaline through my veins. $50,000. He was trying to erase me. He was trying to buy my silence and my departure with pennies while he paraded his mistress around in my family US heritage. Why would I ever sign that, I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You are out of your mind if you think I will surrender my rights to a company I helped you build." Preston stepped closer, invading my personal space, until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Build," he sneered. "You did not build anything. I built Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. I am the face on the cover of Forbes. I am the genius who revolutionized neurostabilizers. You are just a biochemist who dropped out of the industry 6 years ago to play house. No one even remembers your name in the scientific community. If you do not sign this paper tonight, I will freeze every account you have by midnight. You will leave this gala with nothing. No money, no home, no reputation. I will tell the press you had a mental breakdown. I will ruin you." His words were designed to break me, to reduce me to the terrified, submissive wife he thought I was. He expected me to cry. He expected me to fall apart and beg for his mercy. And for a fleeting second, the old me, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, wanted to do exactly that. But then I thought about the truth he was so desperate to bury. 6 years ago, we were both broke graduate students. I was the one spending 80 hours a week in the university laboratory. I was the one who developed the baseline molecular formula for the neurostabilizer that put Vanguard Pharmaceuticals on the map. I had the raw data. I had the initial patents, but Preston had the charm, the business acumen, and the connections. He convinced me to step back to let him handle the corporate sharks while I managed our life. He told me the industry was too vicious for someone as pure-hearted as me. He convinced me to transfer the preliminary patent rights to a joint holding company so he could secure seed funding. I gave up my career. I gave up my passion. I traded my microscope for seating charts and charity galas, believing his promise that we were building an empire together. But he had slowly and methodically erased my name from every public record of the drug as creation. He had stolen my life as work. I looked down at the cubic zirconia on the floor, then up at the post-nuptial agreement on the counter. My heart stopped pounding with fear and began to beat with a cold, terrifying clarity. Preston thought I was stupid. He thought years of arranging flowers had erased the genius-level intellect that created his flagship product. He was wrong. You really believe I'm nothing without you? I said, my tone shifting from desperate to dangerously calm. You really believe you are the sole architect of this empire? I am the empire, he snapped. Now pick up the pen and sign the damn paper, Elena. Madison is waiting for me to make the opening toast. Do not embarrass me tonight. I slowly reached for the silver fountain pen resting beside the documents. I did not shake. I did not shed a single tear. I uncapped the pen and looked at the signature line. Preston smirked, crossing his arms over his chest, fully believing he had won. He believed he had successfully crushed my spirit. What he did not know was that I had spent the last 3 days reviewing the original holding company documents. What he did not know was that the joint trust required both of our signatures to finalize the impending $10 billion merger he was celebrating tonight. What he did not know was that I had already spoken to the Federal Patent Office. I pressed the nib of the pen against the thick paper. I signed my name with deliberate, elegant strokes. I signed away my right to his cash. I signed away my right to the penthouse. I gave him exactly what he wanted. I dropped the pen on the counter and picked up the post-nuptial agreement, handing it to him. His smirk widened into a triumphant grin as he quickly inspected the signature. Good girl, he mocked, folding the document and slipping it into his breast pocket. See how easy things are when you just accept reality. Now put on the necklace and come outside. I looked at the cheap fake diamond on the floor. I stepped forward and crushed it under the heel of my stiletto, feeling the cheap glass shatter against the marble floor. I think I will skip the toast, I said, my voice dripping with ice. And you can tell Madison she can keep the choker. Consider it a parting gift. Preston frowned, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. Where do you think you are going? You have no money and nowhere to go? I'm going home, Preston. I smiled a sharp, predatory smile that made him take half a step back. Enjoy the gala. Enjoy the applause, because tomorrow morning you are going to wake up and realize you just forced the actual owner of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals out of your life. I did not wait for his response. I turned and walked out of the cloakroom, my head held high. I pushed past the heavy oak doors and stepped into the glittering ballroom. I saw Madison laughing with a group of investors, my grandmother oozed diamonds sparkling against her skin. I felt a brief stab of anger, but I let it wash over me. She could have the diamonds. She could have the cheating husband. Because by the time the sun came up, I was going to take everything else. Preston stood there with that arrogant smirk plastered across his perfectly shaved face, waiting for the tears he was so absolutely certain would come. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces. He expected my hands to tremble so violently that I would barely be able to hold the silver fountain pen he had provided. He wanted me to beg him to reconsider, to plead for the life I had built for us. But as I stared at the insulting post-nuptial agreement resting on the cold marble counter, a profound and terrifying absolute stillness washed over my entire body. I did not cry. The woman who would have cried for him died the moment that cheap cubic zirconia hit her chest. I picked up the heavy pen and pressed the sharp nib to the thick legal paper. I signed my name with slow, deliberate, and forceful strokes. Every single letter was a silent blood oath, guaranteeing his impending destruction. I let him think he had won the war when he had only won a single battle I allowed him to have. I picked up the document and handed it back to him. Then for just a split second, I deliberately let my rigid posture collapse. I let my shoulders sag heavily and allowed my breathing to hitch uncontrollably, as if the sheer gravity of my new poverty was finally crushing my spirit. I stumbled backward, clutching my chest in a perfectly orchestrated display of sudden panic. As I staggered, my hand clumsily knocked hard into his tailored jacket. His unlocked mobile phone slipped from his inner breast pocket and clattered loudly onto the polished tile floor. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," I gasped, dropping to my knees in an instant. My voice shook with a flawless imitation of pathetic hysteria. I scrambled on the floor, my hands hovering erratically over his device. Preston let out a dramatic, heavy sigh of profound disgust, clearly repulsed by my weak display. "Leave it alone, Elena. You are making a ridiculous scene," he snapped, looking up into the vanity mirror to smooth his lapels and fix his posture. That brief window of his vain distraction was the only opening I required. Hidden tightly in the sweaty palm of my left hand was a custom encrypted sync drive, no larger than a standard car key fob. I pressed the flat edge of the drive flush against the back of his phone. The tiny indicator light flashed a solid green, confirming the high-speed wireless data transfer was complete. I had secretly initiated the network hack 30 minutes ago when he foolishly left his phone sitting on the bar, but I needed this final physical proximity to forcefully bypass the biometric firewall and complete the raw download of his secure local folders. I slipped the hot drive back into my clutch, scooped up his phone and stood up slowly. My hands were shaking now, but absolutely not from fear. They were shaking with a violent electric adrenaline. I handed the phone back to him, keeping my eyes downcast, playing the pathetic part of the defeated broken wife to absolute perfection. "Try to pull yourself together before you leave the hotel," he muttered, snatching the expensive phone roughly from my hand. I turned away without speaking another word and walked straight out of the cloakroom. The air in the grand ballroom felt incredibly thick and suffocating as I re-entered the party. The hired string quartet was playing a lively, joyous waltz, but all I could hear was the deafening rush of my own blood pumping through my ears. I navigated silently through the dense sea of designer silk gowns and custom-tailored tuxedos, keeping my gaze locked firmly on the heavy brass exit doors at the far end of the hall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Madison again. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back, while my late grandmother, US priceless diamonds, sparkled aggressively under the massive crystal chandeliers. A waiter offered me a tall flute of champagne as I passed, but I ignored him entirely. I pushed my body weight against the heavy revolving doors and stepped out into the humid, thick New York night air. The city was intensely alive with the chaotic sound of blaring taxi horns and chattering wealthy pedestrians, but I felt entirely detached from every single moving piece of it. I was a ghost, walking silently among the living. The valet quickly brought my ordered Uber around to the front curb. It was a standard black sedan that would blend perfectly into the endless stream of meaningless city traffic. I climbed into the dark back seat and immediately locked the heavy doors. The black leather was cold against my bare shoulders. "Take me away from here. Just drive north," I told the driver, my voice completely monotone and hollow. The car pulled away from the brightly lit curb, leaving the glittering, deceptive facade of the Plaza Hotel far behind me in the rearview mirror. As soon as the vehicle merged seamlessly onto the busy avenue, I opened my clutch and pulled out the small black sync drive. It felt incredibly heavy in my palm. It was the master key to unlocking the true devastating extent of my husband's betrayal. I pulled a sleek, lightweight tablet from my bag and plugged the drive directly into the baseboard. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glowing light over my face in the dark, quiet cabin of the moving car. A grey progress bar flashed quickly across the screen as the complex decryption software went to work chewing through his security protocols. It only took 40 seconds, but sitting in the back of that car, it felt like an entire lifetime. When the main route directory finally loaded, my stomach twisted violently into a tight, painful knot. The sheer massive volume of stolen data was staggering to look at. There were thousands of emails, text messages, encrypted financial spreadsheets, and hidden offshore banking routing numbers. Preston had arrogantly backed up his entire corrupt life to a secure cloud server, and my drive had successfully cloned every single byte of his secrets. I opened the private messaging application first. I needed to see exactly how long I had been played for an absolute fool. I clicked on the locked thread with Madison. The messages dated back over 2.5 years. 2.5 years of stolen luxury weekends, fake European business trips, and late-night phone calls taken from his home office while I slept in the next room. He called her his true equal. He called her the only ambitious woman who truly understood his grand vision for the future. But the betrayal cut far deeper than simple physical infidelity. I scrolled mechanically through hundreds of messages where they openly and viciously mocked my existence. They laughed endlessly about my modest conservative wardrobe. They joked cruelly about how easily I was manipulated into giving up my vital laboratory time just to plan his corporate bonding retreats. Madison had actually texted him a candid picture of me at a cancer charity gala last month with a caption that read, "She looks like a pathetic lost puppy begging for table scraps." Preston had replied immediately saying, "She is useful for the public optics, but do not worry, babe. Her time is almost up, I promise you." I read the disgusting words over and over again, letting the raw cruelty wash entirely over my mind. I did not shed a single tear. The deep emotional pain was rapidly transmuting into something cold, sharp, and highly dangerous. The soft, naive woman they were mocking no longer existed in this universe. They had burned her alive in that cloakroom, and from her smoking ashes, a completely different, calculating creature was taking shape. I closed the messaging application with a swipe of my finger. The infidelity was a bitter, toxic pill to swallow, but it was not the fatal weapon I needed to destroy him. I needed financial leverage. I needed the legal mechanism of his absolute destruction. I navigated deeper into the drive to a heavily encrypted folder labeled simply Project Horizon. The mere name sent a massive jolt of electricity straight down my spine. Project Horizon was the original internal code name for the revolutionary neurostabilizer formula I had personally developed in graduate school. It was the exact foundational intellectual property that Vanguard Pharmaceuticals was entirely built upon. I opened the large folder and found a dense labyrinth of complex legal documents. My eyes scanned the thick paragraphs of corporate legalese, rapidly searching for the anomaly I knew had to be hiding there. And then I finally found it. It was a recent series of emergency board resolutions and intellectual property asset transfer agreements dated just 3 days ago. My breath caught sharply in my throat as I zoomed in tightly on the signature line of the primary authorization document. There, resting in bold black digital ink, was my exact signature. It was a totally flawless master forgery. Every single loop curve and pressure point of my natural handwriting had been meticulously digitally replicated. The document illegally authorized the immediate and permanent transfer of the baseline pharmaceutical patent from our joint holding trust directly into a newly formed anonymous corporate entity. I quickly cross-referenced the new entity name against the offshore banking files I had just downloaded. It was a hidden shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The sole listed financial beneficiary of the offshore shell company was Madison. The jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed violently into place with terrifying absolute clarity. Preston was not just cheating on me with a younger employee. He was executing a highly calculated, hostile takeover of my entire life US work. Next week, Vanguard Pharmaceuticals was scheduled to finalize a massive $10 billion corporate merger with a global multinational conglomerate. The entire financial valuation of that historic merger was based completely on the exclusive ownership of my specific neurostabilizer patent. By illegally transferring the patent to an offshore shell company in Madison, US name Preston was mathematically ensuring that the $10 billion payout would completely bypass our joint marital accounts. He was stripping our shared holding trust totally bare before filing the divorce papers. Once the insulting post-nuptial agreement I just signed was filed and the corporate merger was complete, I would be left with absolutely nothing but $50,000, while he and Madison walked away with $10 billion born directly from my scientific genius. I stared hard at the forged signature glowing on the tablet screen. This was not just a dirty divorce tactic. This was massive federal fraud. This was corporate embezzlement on a historic scale. Preston genuinely thought he was playing a simple game of chess with a weak, mindless pawn. He had absolutely no idea he had just blindly handed the board over to the queen. I calmly closed the tablet and slipped it back into my leather bag. The Uber pulled to a smooth stop at a red light on a quiet street. The bright neon glow of a corner bodega illuminated the dark interior of the car. I reached for my phone again. I needed someone who understood the dark, intricate web of corporate financial fraud far better than anyone else in New York City. I needed the one single person Preston deeply feared, but constantly underestimated because of his own blinding arrogance. I dialed the number and waited in the silent car as it rang out into the night. It rang exactly 3 times before the line clicked open. There was no groggy greeting and no confusion in her voice, despite the fact that it was nearly 2 in the morning. Maya was already wide awake. She was my brother's wife, and she was a woman who practically lived on black coffee and complex data streams. Maya was a fiercely brilliant African-American forensic accountant who had built a terrifying reputation in the financial district. She made a highly lucrative career out of hunting down hidden assets and dismantling corrupt corporate structures for elite law firms. Preston had always despised her. He constantly told me to keep my distance from her, claiming she was overly aggressive and cynical. But sitting in the back of that dark car, clutching the stolen digital evidence of my husband's massive betrayal, I finally understood why Preston hated her so much. He was absolutely terrified of her. Maya was the only person in our entire glittering social circle who had never once fallen for his charismatic billionaire routine. She saw the snake hiding perfectly beneath the expensive tailored suits. I told the Uber driver to change the destination to a 24-hour diner we used to frequent in Hell's Kitchen. I spoke softly into the phone and told Maya I needed her help immediately. I told her I had Preston's private files and that he was moving the baseline formula. I did not need to explain anything else. She simply told me to order her a black coffee and hung up the phone. The diner was a harsh contrast to the glittering crystal chandeliers and expensive silk gowns of the Plaza Hotel. It was a narrow, dimly lit space that smelled heavily of stale frying oil and burnt coffee grounds. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, constant hum that set my raw nerves completely on edge. I sat alone in a cracked, red vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. I kept my leather bag clutched tightly against my chest. Every time the small bell above the glass door chimed, my heart violently slammed against my ribs. I was completely paranoid. I kept expecting Preston's private security team to walk through the doors and drag me back to the penthouse. But it was only tired night shift workers and lost tourists seeking cheap food in the middle of the night. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open and Maya walked in. Even at 2 in the morning, dressed in a simple tan trench coat thrown hastily over dark sweatpants, she commanded the entire room. She had a powerful, unyielding presence that instantly made me feel marginally safer. Her dark eyes scanned the rundown diner with calculated precision before locking onto my booth in the back. She walked over with purposeful, heavy strides, sliding into the creaking vinyl seat across from me. She did not offer me a pitying hug. She did not ask me how I was feeling or offer meaningless words of comfort. Maya knew that sympathy would only make me crumble, and right now, we absolutely could not afford for me to fall apart. She placed a sleek silver laptop on the sticky laminate table and looked me dead in the eyes. "Show me what you have," she demanded, her voice low and steady. I reached into my bag with trembling fingers and pulled out the small black encrypted sync drive. I slid it across the table like it was a live grenade. I told her I had cloned his entire primary device, including the biometric locked folders. I explained that I found a massive cache of forged legal documents transferring the exclusive rights of my Project Horizon formula to an offshore shell company. I told her the sole beneficiary of that hidden company was his vice president, Madison. Maya did not show a single ounce of surprise. Her expression hardened into a mask of pure, absolute focus. She plugged the small drive into the side port of her laptop, and her fingers immediately began to fly across the illuminated keyboard. The reflection of the complex data streams danced across her dark eyes as she rapidly bypassed the remaining surface-level encryptions. I sat in total agonizing silence, watching the only person I trusted systematically tear apart my husband's carefully constructed empire. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound in our corner of the diner was the sharp, rapid clicking of her manicured nails against the keys and the low buzzing of the neon sign in the window. Then she abruptly stopped typing. She let out a long, slow breath and leaned back against the red vinyl booth. "Elena," She started her tone, carrying a heavy weight that made my stomach instantly drop. You were right about the forgery, but the reality of this financial structure is significantly worse than you thought. Preston is not just transferring the intellectual property to a shell company. He has constructed a highly sophisticated, multi-layered corporate labyrinth designed to completely wash the asset clean before the corporate merger goes through next week. She turned the silver laptop around so I could see the screen. It was filled with complicated flowcharts and dense banking codes that made absolutely no sense to me. I asked her to explain it to me in simple terms. Maya pointed to a small red box at the top of the complex chart. This is the holding trust you and Preston share, she explained patiently. This is where your baseline formula currently lives, legally. Now look down here. She pointed to a series of interconnected blue boxes that cascaded down the screen. He used your perfectly forged signature to authorize a massive asset transfer to a primary dummy corporation located in Delaware. But it does not stop there. From Delaware, the asset rights are automatically fragmented and bounce through 3 separate international banking institutions before finally landing in the Cayman Islands shell company controlled by Madison. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of his calculated deception. Why would he make it so complicated? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why not just transfer it directly to her? Because he's trying to outrun the federal auditors. Maya replied, her eyes narrowing with intense professional disgust. If he transfers a $10 billion asset directly to his mistress right before a massive corporate merger, it triggers an immediate automatic investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. It is a massive red flag. But by bouncing the patent rights through this specific international sequence, he's effectively laundering the intellectual property. By the time the asset reaches the Cayman Islands, it will look completely legitimate on paper. It will look like a standard foreign acquisition. And once it clears that final international hurdle, the original trace is permanently severed. You will never be able to legally prove the formula belonged to you. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over my entire body. He had planned this down to the absolute smallest detail. He had spent months carefully building this invisible trap around me while I was busy picking out imported marble for his kitchen renovations. I asked her how much time we had left before the asset cleared the final offshore bank and vanished forever. Maya turned the laptop back towards herself and began typing rapidly again, pulling up a secure international banking ledger. She scanned the raw data for a few tense seconds before stopping. She looked up at me, and the grim expression on her face told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. We have exactly 48 hours, she said, her voice completely devoid of its usual confident edge. The initial transfer out of your joint trust was executed yesterday afternoon. The international clearing protocols mandate a mandatory 3-day holding period for assets of this magnitude to prevent wire fraud. The final firewall drops on Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. If we do not secure a federal injunction to freeze the movement of this asset before that clock runs out, the patent is gone forever. You will be completely locked out of the $10 billion merger, and Preston walks away completely untouchable. Friday morning. The timeline hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Friday morning was the exact same day Preston was scheduled to stand on a brightly lit stage and officially sign the massive merger agreement with the global conglomerate on live television. He was planning to finalize the theft of my life's work at the exact same moment the international money cleared Madison's hidden account. It was a perfectly synchronized execution. We need to hire a lawyer right now, I said, my voice rising in a sudden sharp wave of absolute panic. We need the most aggressive corporate litigator in New York. We need someone who can draft an emergency injunction and present it to a federal judge by tomorrow morning. I do not care how much it costs, Maya. I will drain my personal savings, I will sell my jewelry, I will do whatever it takes to stop him from taking my formula. Maya slowly closed the silver laptop. The sharp click of the latch echoed loudly in the quiet diner. She looked at me with a mixture of deep sorrow and intense burning anger. She reached across the sticky table and gently placed her hand over mine. Elena, she said softly, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to stay completely calm. My heart began to pound a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling uncontrollably. What else did you find in those files, Maya? She shook her head slowly. I did not find anything else in his files, Elena. But when you called me and told me what was happening, I immediately ran a quiet diagnostic check on your personal financial footprint. I wanted to see exactly how much liquid capital we had to work with to hire the injunction team. She paused, taking a slow, deep breath before delivering the final fatal blow. Preston did not wait until midnight to freeze your accounts, she told me, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He initiated a total asset lockdown the moment you walked out of that cloakroom at the hotel. I checked your primary checking, your personal savings, and your private investment portfolio. They are all completely frozen under a manufactured suspicious activity hold. I stared at her, unable to fully process the words coming out of her mouth. That is impossible, I stammered, pulling my phone out of my bag with shaking hands. I have my own private credit cards. I have accounts that are entirely in my name. He cannot just freeze them without my authorization. I opened my secure mobile banking application. The screen loaded brightly, illuminating my panicked face. I stared at the bold red letters glaring back at me from the top of the digital dashboard. Account suspended. Please contact your administrator. I frantically switched to my secondary credit card application. The exact same aggressive red warning message appeared. Account locked. 0 available credit. I felt all the air completely leave my lungs. Preston had not just cut off my access to his massive billionaire wealth, he had systematically weaponized his immense corporate power to trigger a massive false fraud alert across my entire financial identity. He had effectively erased my ability to exist in the modern world. I had absolutely no money to hire a lawyer. I had no money to rent a hotel room. I did not even have enough liquid cash to pay for the black coffee sitting on the table in front of Maya. He knows, Maya said, her voice tightening with raw fury. He knows that you need a highly specialized legal team to file a federal injunction against a corporate entity of his size. And he knows that those lawyers demand massive upfront retainers. He froze your accounts to ensure you cannot fight back. He has trapped you in a corner with absolutely no resources and a ticking clock that runs out in exactly 48 hours. I sat perfectly still in the creaking vinyl booth, staring blankly at the dark screen of my useless phone. Preston had coldly and methodically stripped me of my past, my present, and my future. He had stolen my brilliant scientific work, he had humiliated me in front of the entire city, and now he had left me completely financially paralyzed in the middle of the night. He genuinely believed he had delivered the final crushing blow. He believed I would simply curl up in a dark corner and surrender to his overwhelming power. But as I sat there, in that dingy neon-lit diner, looking at the fierce, determined face of my sister-in-law, the crushing panic slowly began to recede. It was rapidly replaced by a cold, highly concentrated and terrifying anger. Preston had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He assumed that because he had taken my money, he had taken my power. He forgot that I was the brilliant architect who drew the very blueprints of his entire empire. I looked up at Maya, my vision perfectly clear and my hands completely steady. I do not need a lawyer to stop him, Maya, I said, my voice echoing with a dark, heavy certainty. He built his entire corrupt house on my foundation, and I know exactly where the structural weaknesses are. We are not going to fight him in a courtroom. We are going to burn his entire company to the ground from the inside out. Maya stared at me for a long, silent moment. Then a slow, dangerous, and incredibly sharp smile spread across her face. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, she said. The sun was just beginning to rise over the East River, casting a cold gray light across the Manhattan skyline as my Uber pulled up to the private entrance of our luxury residential building. I thanked the driver mechanically and stepped out into the damp morning air. I had spent the last 3 hours sitting in that dimly lit diner with Maya plotting the financial destruction of my husband, but as I walked into the lavish marble lobby, a wave of deep physical exhaustion washed over me. The overnight concierge, Thomas, looked away instantly when I approached the polished mahogany desk. Preston had clearly already contacted the building management and given the staff strict new orders regarding my downgraded status. I ignored the heavy, awkward silence and stepped confidently into the private glass elevator, pressing the silver button for the top-floor penthouse. The smooth, silent ride to the summit gave me exactly 40 seconds to lock my fragile emotions away in a dark mental box. I was no longer the heartbroken, terrified wife returning to a shattered home. I was a highly trained biochemist stepping into a contaminated environment to gather the final necessary empirical data. The heavy elevator door slid open with a soft melodic chime, revealing the expansive, bright, open concept living room of the penthouse I had meticulously designed and furnished over the last 6 years. The first thing my eyes focused on was the massive mountain of black designer leather luggage piled carelessly by the heavy oak front door. 4 of my large travel suitcases were zipped shut, bulging at the seams, and stacked aggressively next to a leaning tower of flattened cardboard moving boxes. Preston had not even waited for the sun to come up before he actively started erasing my physical presence from his daily life. I walked slowly past the packed bags, the soft clicking of my high heels echoing loudly off the pristine imported hardwood floors. My attention was immediately drawn away by the sharp hissing sound of the expensive Italian espresso machine running in the custom kitchen. I turned the corner of the long hallway and stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting incredibly casually on one of the white leather bar stools at my sprawling marble kitchen island was Madison. She was wearing a plush white monogrammed spa robe that I instantly recognized as my own. Her bare legs were crossed elegantly, and she was scrolling lazily through her expensive mobile phone. In her right hand, she held a delicate hand-painted ceramic mug that my late mother had bought for me in Florence. It was the single object in this massive, cold, empty penthouse that actually held deep, profound sentimental value to my heart. Madison took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, steaming espresso and finally looked up from her glowing screen. A slow, mocking, vicious smile spread entirely across her perfectly painted lips when she saw me standing there in my rumpled, ruined silk dress from the disastrous gala last night. "Good morning, Elena," she said, her tone dripping with a sickly sweet, utterly fake brand of sympathy. "I really hope you do not mind that I made myself completely comfortable while waiting for you to finally arrive. Preston had an early emergency meeting with the executive board to handle some minor public relations issues regarding your pathetic little public meltdown last night at the hotel. He specifically asked me to stay behind this morning and personally make sure your permanent transition out of this property goes quickly and smoothly." I stared blankly at her manicured fingers, wrapped tightly around my mother's fragile mug. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this woman sitting in my private sanctuary, wearing my personal clothing and drinking from my sacred cup was almost enough to make me lose my carefully constructed mental composure. "What permanent transition?" I asked, keeping my vocal tone intentionally flat and entirely devoid of any readable emotion. Madison laughed, a sharp, cruel, grating sound that violently scraped against my raw, exhausted nerves. "The moving truck arrives in exactly 1 hour," she announced proudly, gesturing vaguely toward the massive pile of expensive luggage sitting by the front door. "Preston generously leased a small rundown studio apartment for you, out in the deepest part of Queens. He even paid the first 3 months of cheap rent in advance out of the goodness of his heart. You should be thanking him on your bare knees, Elena." I walked very slowly toward the marble kitchen island, intentionally closing the physical distance between us. I desperately needed to get close enough for my cellular phone microphone to pick up her arrogant voice perfectly. I slid my right hand casually into my open leather bag and blindly pressed the side volume button on my device exactly 3 times to secretly activate the emergency hidden voice recording application Maya had securely installed for me hours ago. The phone vibrated once sharply against my fingertips, confirming the high-definition audio capture was successfully live and recording. "You really think you have completely won this game, Madison?" I said, my voice trembling violently, just enough to sound thoroughly broken and entirely defeated. "You genuinely think you can just step right into my life and easily take over everything I painstakingly built from the ground up?" Madison rolled her dark eyes dramatically and set the priceless ceramic mug down on the hard marble counter with a heavy, dangerous thud. "You did not build a single thing in this entire empire, Elena," she sneered, leaning forward aggressively so I could smell her expensive floral perfume. "You are just a washed-up, irrelevant biochemist who has not set foot inside a real functioning laboratory in over 6 long years. You have been entirely out of the lab so long, you do not even understand how the modern cutthroat pharmaceutical business actually works anymore. You actually naively thought your little generic baseline chemical formula was the truly valuable part of this massive company. It takes aggressive genius corporate strategy and ruthless global market positioning to build a $10 billion empire. Preston desperately needed a true intellectual equal, not a pathetic, quiet, little submissive housewife who spends her empty days blindly picking out seasonal floral arrangements for his dinner parties. I immediately let my tense shoulders slump forward heavily, playing the exact pathetic submissive role she so desperately wanted to see standing before her. I looked down at the expensive hardwood floor, acting as though her harsh, cruel words had completely shattered my last remaining shred of human confidence. But even if he illegally pushes me out of the company, how do you actually legally benefit from the massive corporate merger? I asked, my voice sounding pathetic thin and incredibly small. The primary medical patent is tightly registered to our joint marital holding trust. The federal government will never allow him to just blindly hand you a $10 billion payout directly without triggering massive alarms. The federal auditors will instantly freeze the entire transaction the moment they see your name listed on the internal financial transfer documents. Madison threw her head back and laughed incredibly loudly, genuinely and deeply amused by my apparent total, utter financial ignorance. "Oh, Elena, you really are incredibly stupid and painfully naive," she mocked, shaking her head in profound pity. "We are not using the outdated joint holding trust anymore. Preston already moved the core intellectual property completely out of your name last night, using your own flawless forged signature. The massive asset is currently bouncing rapidly through a perfectly legal, invisible sequence of offshore holding accounts." I blinked my eyes rapidly, acting completely overwhelmed and deeply confused by her complex explanation. "Offshore accounts," I repeated, weakly wiping a fake tear from my eye. "But that still leaves a massive digital paper trail. The Securities and Exchange Commission will easily trace the origin back to the Delaware Dummy Corporation. They will see the massive funds going directly to you." Madison smiled, a cold, predatory, sociopathic smile, completely blinded by her own massive, unhinged ego and her desperate, pathetic need to prove her superior intellect to the older woman she was permanently replacing. "They will not see a single thing," she bragged, leaning significantly closer to my face. "The final destination is a highly secure, airtight shell company based entirely in the Cayman Islands. It is legally called Apex Global Ventures. The specific international routing number is 749-20185. By the time the slow federal auditors even think to look at the Delaware Dummy Corporation, the entire patent valuation will be permanently resting in a private offshore account where they have absolutely zero legal jurisdiction. You are completely locked out of the system, Elena. The massive money is entirely mine. The pharmaceutical company is entirely mine. And starting today, this beautiful penthouse is entirely mine. The emergency audio recording application running silently in my dark bag perfectly captured every single arrogant syllable she spoke. She had just explicitly stated the exact name of the hidden illegal shell company and the exact numeric international routing number we desperately needed to file the emergency federal injunction. She had just proudly handed me the loaded weapon and pointed it directly at her own head. I stood up perfectly straight, immediately dropping the pathetic, defeated physical posture. The sudden, rapid, aggressive shift in my physical energy made Madison flinch backward slightly in genuine surprise. I reached firmly across the cold marble counter, grabbed my mother's delicate ceramic mug directly from her hand, and poured the remaining dark steaming espresso directly onto the pristine hardwood floor. "Do not ever touch my things again," I said, my voice completely dead flat and absolutely ice cold. I turned my back on her, leaving the designer leather luggage sitting untouched by the door, and walked straight out of the penthouse without looking back. I had exactly what I came for. The elevator ride down to the main lobby felt completely different this time. I was no longer a terrified victim being cast out of my own home in disgrace. I was a ghost walking silently through walls. I stepped out of the heavy brass elevator and walked straight past the polished mahogany concierge desk without sparing Thomas a single glance. He nervously pretended to be deeply engrossed in his computer screen, clearly instructed not to make any eye contact with the disgraced wife. The morning air was sharp and intensely bright as I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the luxury residential building. I stood on the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, feeling the massive crushing weight of the last 6 years, physically lifting off my shoulders. A sleek silver sedan pulled up aggressively to the curb with a sharp screech of heavy brakes. Maya rolled down the tinted passenger window. Her dark eyes were sharp and highly alert, scanning the street for any of Preston's private security details. "Get in," she commanded, her voice tight with heavy anticipation. I slid quickly into the soft leather passenger seat and immediately pulled my cellular phone from my leather bag. I did not waste time with standard greetings. I brought up the secure audio file and played the crystal clear recording of Madison bragging loudly in my custom kitchen. Maya listened in absolute dead silence as Madison's arrogant voice filled the small enclosed space of the car, openly listing the exact Cayman Islands shell company name and the precise international numeric routing number. The recording perfectly captured her mocking tone and her total confidence that I was too stupid to understand her complex financial crimes. When the recording finally finished, Maya let out a low, highly impressed whistle. She gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. "She actually just handed you the loaded gun," Maya said, shaking her head in sheer profound disbelief. I leaned back heavily against the seat and looked out the window at the rapidly passing city streets. "She did not just hand it to me," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of all fear. "She practically pulled the trigger for us. Drive straight to the federal building, Maya. We have a $10 billion transaction to completely derail today." Maya slammed her heavy boot onto the gas pedal, and the powerful car surged violently forward, merging aggressively into the thick, chaotic morning traffic. The massive grey stone facade of the Federal Commercial Building loomed ominously over the downtown plaza, casting a long, dark shadow across the concrete pavement. We rapidly bypassed the slow, crowded public security lines and walked purposefully straight toward the highly specialized Commercial Fraud Division. Maya had extensive high-level contacts deep inside this specific department, from her many years of ruthlessly dismantling corrupt corporate empires for elite clients. We were quickly escorted into a small, sterile office with harsh fluorescent lighting bouncing sharply off the pale green walls. Sitting across a heavy metal desk was Agent Davis, a stern older man with graying hair who had personally known Maya for over a decade. He looked completely exhausted, clutching a cheap styrofoam cup of black coffee, but his tired eyes sharpened dramatically when Maya placed my silver laptop directly onto his desk and opened the secure clone drive. "We are filing an emergency fraudulent transfer hold on a Class A medical patent," Maya stated firmly, sliding a crisp printed copy of my perfectly forged signature across the scratched metal desk. "The primary asset is currently in transit through a Delaware dummy corporation attempting to clear international customs into a Cayman Islands shell company explicitly named Apex Global Ventures. Here is the exact routing number and the secretly recorded audio confession of the corporate officer who personally orchestrated the illegal asset transfer." Agent Davis slowly put on his reading glasses and picked up the paper. He scrutinized the forged signature carefully, comparing the digital pressure points, and then he listened intently to the audio file I played loudly from my phone. The small room was dead silent, except for Madison's obnoxious, high-pitched voice bragging openly about hiding the massive funds from the federal auditors. I watched the agent jaw tighten with genuine professional anger. "You understand that placing a federal hold of this extreme magnitude requires absolute ironclad proof?" Agent Davis warned, looking directly into my eyes. "If this is a false report filed simply to disrupt a legitimate corporate merger, the personal legal penalties are extremely severe." I leaned forward, resting my bare hands flat on his cold metal desk. "I am the original patent holder of the Project Horizon neurostabilizer," I said, my voice projecting absolute unwavering authority. "My husband Preston forged my signature last night to steal the intellectual property and secretly sell it in a $10 billion corporate merger." "Freeze the asset, Agent Davis. Freeze it right now before it clears the offshore firewall tomorrow morning." The experienced federal agent stared deeply into my eyes for a long, heavy moment before giving a single sharp nod of agreement. He turned his chair toward his heavy desktop computer, and his fingers began flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. He smoothly bypassed the standard, slow bureaucratic red tape and accessed the highest restricted level of the Federal Financial Crimes Database. He deliberately inputted the specific Cayman routing number Madison had so foolishly provided. He manually linked the destination offshore account directly to the original baseline patent registration resting entirely in my name. Then he reached out and hit the final red execution key. A loud, sharp electronic beep echoed loudly through the small, sterile office. The massive federal digital lock snapped securely into place across the global banking network. The fraudulent offshore transfer was instantly frozen in a state of indefinite bureaucratic purgatory. The $10 billion asset could not move forward to the Cayman Islands, and it could not move backward to the Delaware dummy corporation. It was completely trapped in the federal system. The immediate catastrophic ripple effect was absolutely devastating for Preston. We had barely stepped out of the cold federal building and back into the bright, warm morning sunlight when Maya's mobile phone began to vibrate violently in her deep coat pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a highly secure encrypted message from one of her embedded corporate contacts working deep inside the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals executive accounting department. The urgent message contained only 3 terrifying words: total system failure. Maya smiled a cold, brilliant, highly dangerous smile and turned the screen around to show me the text. The Federal Patent Office just automatically notified the acquiring multinational conglomerate that the core asset of the merger is currently under an active criminal fraud investigation. She explained, her voice buzzing with pure electric adrenaline. The conglomerate legal team just panicked and instantly pulled their $10 billion escrow deposit from the joint holding account. Preston's entire historic corporate merger just violently collapsed in a matter of seconds. My own cellular phone suddenly lit up with a massive chaotic flood of rapid notifications. I had temporarily unblocked Preston's personal number just to closely monitor his inevitable complete mental breakdown. My digital screen was completely filled with missed calls and frantic, desperate text messages. "Where are you?" he texted in rapid succession. "Answer the damn phone, Elena. Something massive just went wrong at the firm. Did you speak to anyone last night? Did you tell anyone about the patent? Please tell me you did not talk to any reporters." I stared at his desperate, pathetic messages, feeling a deep, powerful wave of absolute pure satisfaction wash over my entire soul. He was violently drowning in the deep ocean, and he had absolutely no idea who had silently cut a massive hole in the bottom of his luxury yacht. I did not reply to a single message. I simply locked the screen and let him suffer entirely in the terrifying unknown silence. Meanwhile, across the bustling city, in the massive glass executive boardroom of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, Preston was currently experiencing the absolute worst morning of his entire privileged, wealthy life. Maya embedded contact continued to feed us live text updates detailing the absolute chaos violently unfolding on the top floor of the skyscraper. Preston was reportedly screaming at the top of his lungs at his team of expensive corporate lawyers, throwing thick glass water pitchers violently against the expensive walls and aggressively overturning heavy leather executive chairs. He was completely losing his mind. He demanded loudly to know exactly who had leaked the highly classified Cayman routing number to the federal government. But the absolute most beautiful part of his total complete destruction was his blinding, arrogant, deep-seated misogyny. According to the live updates pouring rapidly into my phone, Preston was aggressively pointing his finger at every single rival pharmaceutical chief executive officer in the entire city. He genuinely deeply believed that a highly trained elite corporate spy from a competing billion-dollar empire had somehow hacked his secure mainframe and stolen the routing data. He was frantically ordering his private security team to investigate rival board members, foreign investors, and angry former employees. It never even crossed his arrogant mind to suspect the quiet, submissive wife he had just mercilessly thrown out of his penthouse like garbage. He fully believed I was currently sitting completely broken and crying alone in a cheap queen's apartment with zero financial resources and absolutely zero fight left in my fragile body. He completely underestimated my raw intelligence, my deep resilience, and my profound capacity for cold, calculated vengeance. He honestly thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against powerful corporate giants. He had absolutely no idea he was actually rapidly bleeding to death from a single fatal strike delivered perfectly by the woman he had completely dismissed as a pathetic, helpless pawn. The massive $10 billion merger was completely dead in the water. His corrupt pharmaceutical empire was suddenly bleeding massive amounts of capital, and the federal government was now actively looking deep into his illegal offshore accounts. I turned to Maya, and we walked slowly down the busy avenue, blending perfectly into the massive crowd of ordinary citizens. No one passing us had any idea that we had just silently executed the total financial ruin of one of the most powerful, arrogant billionaires in the entire country. The sheer scale of what we had just accomplished was staggering, but my heart rate remained completely steady and perfectly calm. For 6 long years, I had allowed Preston to dictate my worth, to control my environment, and to steal my brilliant scientific achievements. I had allowed him to build a massive glittering monument to his own massive ego, using the solid foundation I had painstakingly poured with my own bare hands. But today, the foundational earth was finally shifting violently beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. The massive asset freeze was not just a legal maneuver to protect my rightful property, it was a loud, undeniable declaration of absolute war. I looked down at my phone one last time, watching another frantic, terrified message from Preston pop up on the glowing screen. He was begging for me to call him back, promising that we could sit down and rationally discuss the post-nuptial agreement again. He was already desperately trying to pivot to salvage whatever small pieces of his shattered life he could still reach. I smiled coldly and completely powered down the device, sliding it deep into my leather bag. The opening move was flawlessly executed. Now it was time to prepare for his desperate, reckless counterattack. The thick, heavy oak doors of Maya's private brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, closed firmly behind us, securing us inside her meticulously protected fortress. Maya had heavily customized the historic property with military-grade security systems, thick reinforced windows, and a massive network of hidden exterior cameras. It was the only place in the entire city where I felt completely safe from Preston and his vast, endless resources. I collapsed onto the incredibly soft, expensive leather sofa in her dark mahogany library, letting the massive adrenaline crash finally take over my exhausted physical body. My hands were shaking violently now, not from fear, but from the sheer unbelievable magnitude of what we had just accomplished. We had completely paralyzed a $10 billion multinational corporate merger. We had successfully frozen the stolen foundation of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. I closed my tired eyes and took my first deep, full breath in over 6 long, agonizing years. I genuinely believed we had bought ourselves a massive critical window of time to properly legally dismantle him. But my profound sense of safety was a massive, terrifying illusion. I had critically underestimated the rapid, aggressive defense mechanisms built deep into the federal patent registry system. Maya walked into the quiet library carrying 2 tall, steaming mugs of dark black coffee. She set them down on the heavy glass coffee table, but before she could even sit down, her secure silver laptop began to emit a sharp, loud, repetitive warning chime from the dining room table. The piercing electronic sound violently shattered the quiet peace of the house. Maya immediately rushed back into the other room, her heavy boots thudding loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I pushed myself off the deep leather sofa and quickly followed closely behind her, my heart suddenly slamming a frantic, chaotic rhythm against my ribcage. Maya was already typing rapidly on her illuminated keyboard, her dark eyes scanning the complex, cascading lines of green digital code, reflecting brightly off her serious face. "He knows," she said, her voice dropping into a dark, heavy register that sent a sudden, violent chill straight down my entire spine. "He knows it was you, Elena." I stood frozen in the wide doorway, clutching the wooden frame for physical support. "How is that even possible?" I asked, my voice trembling uncontrollably. "You said the federal fraud hold was completely anonymous. You said they would just tell his corporate lawyers that the baseline asset was under a mandatory government review. The hold is anonymous." Maya explained, her fingers flying frantically across the mechanical keys, trying to trace the digital leak. "But we used the exact original baseline patent registration to forcefully trigger the international lock. The automated federal system is legally required to send a standardized digital compliance receipt to the primary corporate administrator on file whenever a massive Tier 1 asset is frozen. Preston is the registered chief executive officer. The federal system just automatically emailed his private secure executive inbox. The automated receipt explicitly stated that the original patent holder successfully initiated the legal freeze. He knows you went to the government. I pulled my cellular phone out of my deep coat pocket and stared blindly at the dark blank screen. For the past 3 hours, Preston had been aggressively, relentlessly flooding my phone with hundreds of frantic, angry text messages and dozens of desperate voicemails. He had been screaming, demanding to know where I was, and begging me to negotiate the post-nuptial agreement. But as I stared at the digital screen right now, the massive chaotic flood of messages had completely and abruptly stopped. There was absolutely nothing. The sudden, heavy, absolute radio silence was infinitely more terrifying than his violent anger. Preston was a dangerous, arrogant predator who violently destroyed anyone who dared to cross him. If he was completely silent, it meant he was no longer panicking. It meant he was actively hunting. "What is he doing?" I asked, staring blankly at the silent phone in my hand. "Why did he stop calling me?" Maya did not answer me immediately. She aggressively opened a new secure encrypted browser window and quickly bypassed the standard public access firewalls to directly enter the highly restricted New York State judicial database. She rapidly cross-referenced Preston's name against all active emergency legal filings in the city. Her dark eyes darted back and forth across the bright screen, absorbing the dense, complicated legal text. Suddenly, all the color completely drained from her beautiful face. She stopped typing and slowly pushed the silver laptop away from her as if the machine itself was physically contaminated. "He is not filing for a hostile divorce," Maya whispered, her voice thick with pure, unadulterated horror. "He is not calling his corporate lawyers to fight the federal injunction. He found a massive, terrifying loophole." "What loophole?" I demanded, stepping quickly toward the table, my breath catching sharply in my tight throat. "Tell me exactly what he is doing, Maya." "He just filed a massive emergency ex parte petition in the state Supreme Court," she explained, turning the glowing screen slightly so I could see the dense, heavy legal document bearing the official state seal. "He is filing for an involuntary emergency psychiatric hold and a temporary medical conservatorship over your entire life. He is weaponizing the federal legal system to legally strip you of every single basic human right you possess." I stared blindly at the complicated legal words on the bright screen, completely unable to process the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her statement. "A conservatorship," I repeated weakly, my mind spinning wildly, completely out of control. "That makes absolutely no legal sense. I am perfectly healthy. I am a highly educated, brilliant biochemist. He cannot just blindly tell a powerful state judge that I am suddenly insane. He's not saying it is sudden." Maya countered, her voice rising with fierce protective anger. "He is meticulously building a highly documented false medical history using the most painful traumatic event of your entire life. Look at the specific supporting documents he attached to the emergency court petition." I leaned closer to the bright screen and felt the entire room begin to violently spin around me. Attached to the aggressive legal petition were dozens of deeply private, highly sensitive therapy records from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, my beloved parents were tragically killed in a horrific multi-car accident on the interstate. The sudden, massive traumatic loss had completely shattered my world. I had fallen into a deep, dark clinical depression. I had cried for months. I had sought intensive professional grief counseling to help me process the overwhelming, agonizing pain. Preston had pretended to be my loving, supportive anchor during that terrible dark time. He had held me while I wept openly in our bed. But he had secretly kept every single medical receipt. He had secretly kept a detailed timeline of my vulnerable emotional state. And now he was viciously twisting that deep, pure human grief into a fabricated diagnosis of severe, long-term delusional psychosis. "He is claiming that your grief completely destroyed your mental capacity," Maya explained, pointing directly to the specific highlighted legal paragraphs. "He's officially telling the state judge that you have been secretly suffering from massive paranoid delusions for the last 3 years. He claims that your public confrontation at the charity gala last night was a massive violent psychotic break. He is stating on the permanent legal record that you falsely believe he is stealing from you because your diseased mind cannot separate reality from deep paranoid fiction. A cold, paralyzing dread washed entirely over my physical body, leaving me completely numb. If the judge grants this emergency petition, what exactly happens to me? I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to a completely different person. If the judge grants this petition, Preston becomes your absolute legal medical proxy. Maya said, her dark eyes burning with intense, fierce rage. You will lose the legal right to make any decisions for yourself. You will not be allowed to hire a lawyer. You will not be allowed to access your own bank accounts. And most importantly, a person who is legally declared mentally incompetent cannot hold a massive federal corporate patent or file a legitimate federal fraud claim. The moment he gains medical conservatorship, he will instantly contact the Federal Patent Office as your legal guardian. He will completely withdraw the intellectual property freeze on your behalf, and the $10 billion corporate merger will instantly go through. He will literally steal your mind to steal your money. The sheer profound evil of his calculated legal strategy hit me like a massive physical blow to my chest. He was not just trying to take my wealth, he was trying to completely erase my legal existence. He was trying to lock me away in a dark, quiet room where no one would ever listen to my warnings, where no one would ever believe a single word I said, because the powerful billionaire husband had officially declared me completely insane. I need her to make a highly secure encrypted phone call immediately, Maya said abruptly, standing up from the dining room table and grabbing her cellular phone. I know a powerful federal judge in the Southern District who owes my family a massive professional favor. I need to get him to instantly issue a conflicting federal protection order to block this state-level conservatorship before Preston can physically execute the medical warrant. Do not move from this room, Elena. Do not answer the door for anyone. I have to go down into the basement to access the hardwired secure landline to ensure the call cannot be intercepted by his private security team. Maya turned and sprinted quickly down the long dark hallway toward the basement door, leaving me completely alone in the massive quiet kitchen. The heavy silence of the fortified brownstone suddenly felt incredibly oppressive and suffocating. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen island, listening to the slow, steady, rhythmic ticking of the expensive grandfather clock in the living room. Every single second that ticked by felt like a massive, heavy weight pressing down onto my lungs. Then the heavy doorbell rang. It was not a normal, polite ring. It was a long, solid, continuous buzz that echoed loudly and aggressively through the entire house. My heart instantly jumped directly into my throat. I slowly backed away from the dining room table, my hands shaking so violently I could barely keep my balance. Maya had specifically said she lived in a highly secure building. No one was supposed to be able to get past the locked outer iron gate without a specific digital entry code. The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied by 3 heavy, loud, violent knocks against the thick, solid oak wood. I crept silently down the hallway, pressing my back tightly against the cool plaster wall. I reached the front foyer and looked at the glowing digital security monitor mounted next to the heavy front door. The high-definition exterior camera showed the front porch in perfect, absolute clarity. Standing on the heavy stone steps were 2 massive, incredibly muscular men. They were wearing dark navy blue medical scrubs, but their physical demeanor completely contradicted their supposed caring profession. They did not look like registered nurses or trained medical orderlies. They had thick, muscular necks, aggressive military-style haircuts, and cold, dead, highly calculating eyes. They looked exactly like highly paid private mercenary security thugs. Parked illegally on the street directly behind them, blocking the entire intersection, was a large, completely unmarked white transport van with heavily tinted black windows. Preston had not waited for the state judge to actually sign the official paperwork. He had used his massive, boundless billionaire wealth and his deep, corrupt connections to secure a preliminary medical transport order. He had hired a private, deeply corrupt psychiatric facility to come and legally kidnap me directly off the street. Elena Hayes, a deep, rough, loud voice called out from the other side of the thick, heavy wooden door. The man was speaking directly into the exterior intercom speaker. We know you are currently inside the residence. We have been dispatched by Vanguard Medical Services to conduct an immediate emergency psychiatric evaluation. We have fully authorized, expedited state medical warrant signed by your husband. Please open the door immediately and cooperate with our medical staff. I pressed my hands tightly over my mouth to completely muffle the terrified, ragged breathing violently escaping my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying desperately that the heavy reinforced oak door and the expensive steel deadbolts would hold them back long enough for Maya to finish her secure phone call in the basement. You are currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis? Elena? The second man called out, his voice taking on a sickeningly sweet, condescending tone that made my stomach churn violently. Your loving husband, Preston, is incredibly deeply worried about your physical safety. He just wants you to get the proper medical help you so desperately need. If you open the door peacefully, we can make this very easy. You can just rest in the back of the transport van. But if you force us to breach this door, we are legally authorized to use heavy chemical restraints to ensure your absolute safety. We do not want to have to heavily sedate you, Elena. They were going to drug me. They were going to forcefully inject a heavy chemical sedative directly into my veins, drag my unconscious body out of my sister-in-law's house, and lock me deep inside a private, unlisted medical facility, where Preston controlled every single doctor on the expensive payroll. They would keep me heavily medicated and completely isolated until I blindly signed away my medical proxy and legally surrendered my $10 billion baseline formula. I looked frantically back down the long, dark hallway, praying to see Maya running up the basement stairs, but the corridor remained completely empty and absolutely terrifyingly quiet. Suddenly, the loud metallic sound of heavy machinery scraping against steel echoed through the small foyer. I looked back at the glowing security monitor in absolute pure horror. The first massive man had pulled a heavy, thick metallic breaching device from a dark duffel bag resting on the stone porch. He attached it directly to the sophisticated electronic locking mechanism of Maya's expensive reinforced door. Preston was a powerful billionaire who employed teams of elite corporate security experts. A standard residential security door, no matter how incredibly expensive, was absolutely nothing but a minor temporary inconvenience to his highly paid mercenaries. A loud, sharp cracking sound violently shattered the wood frame as the massive steel deadbolt was forcefully, violently compromised. The heavy oak door swung open with a terrifying, aggressive force, slamming violently against the interior plaster wall. The two massive men wearing dark navy scrubs stepped aggressively into the quiet foyer, completely filling the small space with their heavy, terrifying physical presence. The lead man looked directly at me, his cold, dead eyes locking onto my completely terrified face. He reached slowly into the deep front pocket of his medical scrubs and pulled out a large, thick, heavy metal syringe filled with a thick, cloudy liquid. "It is time to go to the hospital. Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice completely dead flat and devoid of all human empathy. "Your husband is waiting for you to sign the papers." The massive man in the dark navy scrubs lunged forward with terrifying speed. His heavy boots crushed the splintered wood of the broken doorframe as he closed the narrow distance between us in a single massive stride. I tried to scream, but my voice was completely trapped beneath the crushing weight of pure primal panic. His massive, thick hand clamped down brutally hard over my left shoulder, violently pinning me against the cold plaster wall of the foyer. The rough fabric of his medical scrub smelled sharply of sterile alcohol and cheap, stale tobacco. The second man stepped inside the house, immediately reaching for my flailing right arm. I kicked wildly, my leather boots connecting solidly with his heavy shin, but the man did not even flinch. He just grunted softly and tightened his iron grip around my wrist, twisting my arm painfully behind my back. "Stop fighting me, Elena," the first man growled, his voice dropping the sickly sweet facade and revealing the cold, ruthless mercenary underneath. He raised the thick, heavy metal syringe filled with the cloudy chemical sedative, holding it dangerously close to my exposed neck. "If you keep thrashing around, I might accidentally hit an artery, and that would be a terrible tragedy for your poor, grieving husband." I thrashed my body violently from side to side, using every single ounce of physical strength I possessed, but it was absolutely useless. They were dragging me forcefully toward the shattered front door. The heavy, humid morning air hit my face as my feet scraped loudly against the stone porch. I could see the dark-tinted windows of the unmarked white transport van waiting illegally in the street. The heavy side door of the van was already slid wide open, revealing a dark, terrifying cage. They were going to throw me inside. They were going to make me disappear from the face of the earth. I squeezed my eyes shut and finally found my voice, letting out a massive blood-curdling scream that violently tore through the quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. Let go of her right now, or I will blow a hole straight through your chest. The loud, booming voice did not belong to Maya. The two massive men instantly froze, their heavy hands still gripping my arms tightly. I opened my terrified eyes and looked back into the shattered foyer. Standing perfectly still at the end of the long, dark hallway was Maya. But she was not alone. Standing directly beside her, with his heavy service weapon drawn and pointed precisely at the chest of the lead mercenary, was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark tactical vest with the bright yellow letters spelling United States Marshal across the front. The lead mercenary slowly lowered the heavy metal syringe, his cold, dead eyes darting rapidly between the drawn weapon and the shining silver badge clipped securely to the marshal's belt. We have a fully authorized state medical warrant signed by a Supreme Court judge. The mercenary argued, his rough voice suddenly lacking its previous arrogant confidence. The federal marshal stepped forward into the bright light of the foyer, keeping his heavy weapon perfectly steady. Your state medical warrant is completely null and void. As of midnight last night, the marshal stated, his voice echoing with absolute, undeniable legal authority. Elena Hayes is an active, protected federal whistleblower actively cooperating in a massive Tier 1 corporate fraud investigation. Furthermore, she is currently under the strict protection of a preemptive federal restraining order filed against her husband, Preston Hayes, and any private corporate entity operating under his financial direction. You are currently trespassing on private property and actively attempting to kidnap a protected federal witness. If you do not release her arm in the next 3 seconds, I am legally authorized to use lethal force. The heavy silence that followed was incredibly tense and violently suffocating. The two massive men exchanged a rapid, silent glance. They were highly paid mercenaries, but no amount of billionaire corporate money was worth dying on a wooden porch in Brooklyn or facing federal kidnapping charges. The man holding my right arm slowly let go, taking a massive step backward with his hands raised in the air. The lead man cursed loudly, dropping the heavy metal syringe onto the stone floor, where it shattered loudly, spilling the cloudy chemical sedative across the porch. They turned and sprinted heavily down the front steps, throwing themselves into the unmarked white transport van. The massive engine roared loudly as the tires screeched violently against the asphalt, tearing away from the quiet intersection and disappearing rapidly down the street. I collapsed instantly onto the hard stone porch, my legs completely giving out beneath me. The massive, terrifying adrenaline rush violently evaporated, leaving me shaking uncontrollably and gasping desperately for air. Maya rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside me and pulling me into a fierce, tight embrace. She held me incredibly tightly while the federal marshal calmly holstered his heavy weapon and stepped over the shattered wooden doorframe to visually secure the perimeter of the street. "How did you know?" I sobbed quietly, burying my face into the soft fabric of her coat. "How did you know he would send them?" Maya gently stroked my tangled hair, her own breathing heavy and ragged. "I know how massive, arrogant billionaires think, Elena," she whispered fiercely. "I knew Preston would instantly realize he could not fight a federal financial freeze in a standard commercial courtroom. I knew his only logical strategic move would be to physically eliminate the primary obstacle. That is why I secretly filed the preemptive federal restraining order and the official whistleblower protection documents late last night while you were sleeping in the spare room. I called my contact at the federal courthouse and demanded they fast-track the protective filings before the sun even came up. The marshal was already sitting silently in my kitchen drinking coffee when the massive asset freeze triggered the system alert this morning. He was just waiting for Preston to make his illegal physical move. I looked up at the tall federal marshal standing stoically by the broken door and felt a massive, overwhelming wave of profound gratitude. Preston had completely exhausted his physical brute force options. He could not legally touch me. He could not lock me away in a dark, quiet room. He could not silence my voice with heavy chemical sedatives. For the very first time since I walked out of that glittering charity gala, I genuinely felt like I was actually going to survive this terrifying nightmare. But my profound sense of relief was violently short-lived. Preston was an incredibly ruthless corporate predator, and predators do not simply stop hunting when their initial ambush completely fails. If he could not forcefully lock my physical body away in a private psychiatric ward, he was going to systematically destroy my public reputation until absolutely no one in the world would ever believe a single word I said. We spent the next 3 hours sitting in Maya's secure kitchen while a private contractor hastily repaired and heavily reinforced the shattered front door. I was sipping a warm cup of herbal tea, trying to steady my raw, frayed nerves, when Maya's secure silver laptop suddenly chimed with a rapid series of aggressive digital news alerts. Maya opened the primary browser window, and her dark eyes widened in sheer pure disbelief. She slowly turned the bright screen toward me, and the heavy ceramic teacup completely slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Taking up the entire front digital page of the Wall Street Journal was a massive, highly detailed, exclusive exposé. The bold black headline screamed across the bright screen. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals Chief Executive Officer uncovers massive extortion plot by emotionally unstable ex-wife. I stared blindly at the massive article, my heart completely dropping into my stomach. Preston had forcefully pivoted his entire aggressive strategy. He had unleashed his massive, expensive public relations machine and violently fed them a completely fabricated, highly convincing alternative narrative. The lengthy article claimed that I had secretly stolen his brilliant preliminary research notes out of his private home office 6 years ago. It painted a devastatingly convincing picture of a deeply disturbed, jealous housewife who could not handle his massive public success. The article included highly doctored emails and perfectly forged laboratory logs that seemingly proved Preston was the sole absolute genius behind the Project Horizon baseline formula. Preston even went so far as to include heavily edited audio clips from our massive argument at the charity gala, strategically cutting out his own cruel insults to make me sound completely unhinged and aggressively greedy. The prestigious financial publication quoted several anonymous senior executives from Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, all claiming that I had been secretly demanding massive sums of hush money for months, threatening to artificially derail the impending $10 billion global merger if my financial demands were not immediately met. He was completely flipping the entire narrative. He was explicitly telling the entire financial world that the federal asset freeze was not a legitimate government investigation into his massive corporate fraud, but rather a deeply malicious extortion tactic executed by a bitter, crazy ex-wife. The comment section beneath the massive article was already exploding with thousands of vicious, hateful messages from angry retail investors and absolute strangers, tearing my character into tiny, shredded pieces. They called me a gold digger, a corporate parasite, and a deeply sick woman who belonged in a high-security psychiatric ward. Preston was actively using the massive power of the international press to completely poison the jury pool before we even stepped foot inside a federal courtroom. He knew that if the powerful multinational conglomerate believed his fabricated story, they would completely dismiss my federal patent claims as a desperate extortion attempt and actively push to finalize the lucrative $10 billion merger. He could not physically drag me into the dark, but he was actively burning my entire name to the ground in the blinding public light. By noon, the quiet tree-lined street outside Maya, heavily fortified Brooklyn brownstone, had completely transformed into a chaotic, loud and fiercely aggressive circus. The massive Wall Street Journal article had acted exactly like fresh blood, violently dropped into a starving shark tank. Dozens of ruthless paparazzi and aggressive freelance financial reporters were actively swarming the heavy iron front gate, pushing and shoving each other for a better viewing angle. Massive broadcasting news vans with heavy satellite dishes were parked completely illegally across the narrow residential street, blocking the neighborhood traffic entirely and causing a loud chorus of angry car horns. Every single time I even walked past the thick, reinforced living room window, the bright, violent flashes of heavy professional camera lenses exploded continuously through the narrow gaps in the expensive silk curtains. They were all desperately hunting for a single grainy, pathetic photograph of the crazy, greedy ex-wife to splash across their digital front pages. My cellular phone, which I had completely muted and tossed carelessly onto the soft leather sofa, was continuously vibrating with a steady, endless stream of hateful vitriol. Random strangers from across the entire country, who had absolutely no idea who I truly was, were aggressively hunting down my private social media accounts to leave vicious, threatening digital comments. They called me a pathetic, gold-digging parasite. They called me a deeply disturbed, hysterical woman who was desperately trying to ruin a brilliant, powerful billionaire out of pure, bitter jealousy. The massive, coordinated public character assassination was working flawlessly on a national scale. Preston had successfully weaponized the mainstream media to completely isolate me from the rest of the civilized world. Maya was pacing aggressively back and forth across the dark mahogany library, her heavy combat boots thudding loudly and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She was furiously clutching her secure cellular phone, desperately wanting to go on the absolute total offensive. We cannot just sit quietly in this dark house and let him completely control the global public narrative, Elena. She argued, her voice thick with intense protective rage and utter frustration. I have the crystal-clear digital audio recording of Madison explicitly confessing to the massive offshore wire fraud. I have the highly detailed digital proof of your perfectly forged signature on the primary patent transfer documents. I can easily leak all of this directly to my trusted senior contacts at the New York Times right this very second. We can completely destroy his fake, pathetic victim story before the financial markets even close for the day. She aggressively raised her cellular phone, ready to make the immediate call to the press and detonate his massive lie. I reached out calmly and placed my bare hand gently over hers, physically lowering the device back to her side. Do not call anyone. Maya, I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any trace of panic. Do not leak a single piece of our verified evidence to the press. We are going to remain absolutely and completely silent. Maya stared at me in profound, genuine disbelief, her dark eyes searching my exhausted face for any subtle sign that the massive public pressure had finally broken my fighting spirit. Are you completely out of your mind? She demanded loudly, tossing her hands up into the air. Preston is actively convincing the entire global financial sector that you are a delusional, desperate extortionist. Look at the live stock market ticker, Elena. She pointed aggressively to her open silver laptop sitting open on the heavy glass coffee table. Because the massive multinational conglomerate investors currently believe his completely fabricated story about you. Vanguard Pharmaceutical stock is artificially surging rapidly through the roof. The financial market genuinely thinks he has successfully neutralized the ridiculous, pathetic threat from his crazy ex-wife. His total corporate valuation is climbing by hundreds of millions of dollars every single hour this afternoon. He's actively winning the public war and getting richer while you are hiding in my house. I walked very slowly over to the glass table and looked down at the bright green numbers rapidly climbing across the digital financial screen. A slow, dark, highly calculating smile spread completely across my face. That is exactly what I want to happen. I told her, turning my steady gaze away from the bright screen and looking deeply into her angry, confused eyes. I want his corporate stock to artificially skyrocket into the stratosphere today. I want the powerful board of directors to blindly slap him on the back and congratulate him for handling the messy domestic situation so brilliantly and ruthlessly. I want Preston to feel completely and utterly invincible. Because when a deeply arrogant, wealthy man truly believes he has completely won the war, he entirely stops looking for hidden traps. He will let his massive, expensive guard down to blindly celebrate his fake, glorious victory. Let him climb as high as he possibly can, Maya. The higher he blindly climbs today, the more completely devastating and fatal the final fall will be on Friday morning. Maya slowly lowered her cellular phone, the intense protective anger in her dark eyes gradually shifting back into cold, sharp professional respect. She fully understood the dangerous, high-stakes psychological game I was actively playing. She walked back over to the heavy glass table and pulled her silver laptop much closer to her chest. If we are intentionally letting him win the public relations battle today, then we need to use this quiet distraction to dig even deeper into his encrypted corporate files, she stated, firmly sitting back down. The federal patent fraud is absolutely massive, but Preston employs an entire army of the most expensive defense lawyers in the country. They might actually try to stall the offshore financial investigation by tying the federal courts up in endless complicated jurisdictional red tape for years. If we want to completely destroy him on Friday, we need a secondary heavy weapon. We need something so absolutely fundamentally toxic that no amount of billionaire money or clever legal maneuvering can ever possibly wash it clean. I nodded in complete absolute agreement and sat down heavily beside her on the soft leather sofa, pulling the stolen black encrypted sync drive from my bag. For the next 6 intense hours, we completely ignored the chaotic media circus raging violently outside the front windows. We entirely drowned out the loud shouting reporters and the endless bright flashes of the paparazzi cameras. We dove straight back into the massive, dense digital labyrinth of Preston's stolen private life. We systematically combed through thousands of highly encrypted internal corporate emails, private financial spreadsheets, and locked laboratory reports. We were aggressively hunting for any hidden anomaly that could successfully serve as the final fatal blow. As I slowly scrolled through a highly restricted internal folder containing the historical clinical trial data for the Project Horizon neurostabilizer, a strange, nagging numerical inconsistency suddenly caught my highly trained scientific eye. I asked Maya to rapidly pull up the official public safety reports. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals had legally submitted to the federal regulatory agencies 3 years ago to secure market approval. I placed my digital tablet directly next to her bright silver screen, carefully and meticulously comparing the raw stolen data against the officially published federal documents. My heart instantly began to pound a slow, heavy, terrifying rhythm against my ribs as the dark, horrifying truth slowly began to completely materialize right in front of my eyes. "Oh my God!" I whispered, my voice completely hoarse and barely audible in the quiet, dark library. I leaned significantly closer to the glowing digital screens, completely horrified and sickened by what I was actually reading. This goes so much deeper than simple corporate financial theft, Maya. Preston did not just steal my baseline scientific formula to build his massive pharmaceutical empire, he completely corrupted the entire scientific foundation of the drug. Maya instantly stopped typing and leaned heavily over my shoulder, her sharp eyes rapidly scanning the dense, complicated scientific numbers. "What exactly am I looking at, Elena?" she asked, her tone dropping into a dark, highly serious register. I pointed a trembling finger directly at the raw clinical data glowing on my tablet. When I originally developed this specific molecular compound in graduate school, I explicitly noted a highly dangerous secondary side effect. In approximately 4% of the long-term test subjects, the baseline chemical stabilizer caused severe, highly irregular cardiac arrhythmias. I clearly documented that the raw formula required at least 2 more years of intense, dedicated laboratory refinement to completely stabilize the dangerous cardiac anomaly before it could ever be safely introduced to the public medical market. That is exactly why I initially stepped back from the business side of the company. I wanted to stay completely in the lab to fix the structural chemical flaw. But Preston told me the company was running completely out of early seed funding. He told me he was shelving the Project Horizon formula entirely until we could afford more private research. But he blatantly lied to my face. I pointed to the official federal documents on my screen. He did not shelve the project. He aggressively fast-tracked it into human clinical trials completely behind my back. But look at his official safety reports. The severe cardiac anomaly rate is officially listed at absolutely 0.0%. Maya stared at the conflicting digital documents, her brilliant analytical mind instantly connecting the dark, corrupt dots. He deliberately altered the raw clinical trial data, she stated, her voice buzzing with pure electric shock and profound disgust. He completely erased the dangerous cardiac side effects from the official medical record to quickly secure the massive federal approval. He did not just alter the raw safety data, I replied, opening a deeply hidden locked email chain on my tablet. Look at this specific correspondence between Preston and the lead federal medical regulator assigned to officially review the Project Horizon safety trials. Preston secretly wired over $2 million to a dark offshore account controlled by the regulators. Brother-in-law just 3 days before the neurostabilizer was officially approved for public sale. He explicitly bribed a high-ranking federal official to blindly push a highly dangerous, unrefined drug onto the open market just to artificially inflate his corporate valuation. The heavy, profound silence in the dark mahogany library was absolutely deafening. This was not just a case of an arrogant billionaire stealing money from his wife during a bitter divorce. This was a massive, catastrophic federal crime that directly endangered the physical lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent patients currently relying on his fraudulent medication. Preston had built his entire $10 billion empire on a massive, terrifying mountain of lies, forged signatures, and highly illegal federal bribes. Maya slowly leaned back against the heavy leather sofa, a cold, dangerous predator smile returning completely to her beautiful face. "The Wall Street Journal can print whatever garbage they want today," she said softly. "Let his stock soar. Let him drink expensive champagne with his mistresses. Because when you walk into that massive corporate merger meeting on Friday morning, you are not just taking your money back, Elena. You are going to send that arrogant man to federal prison for the rest of his natural life." The massive grandfather clock in the corner of Maya dark mahogany library chimed heavily, signaling that it was already Wednesday evening. The chaotic media circus outside the reinforced front windows had finally begun to thin out as the aggressive reporters retreated to file their vicious evening broadcasts. Inside the quiet house, the heavy weight of the ticking clock was becoming incredibly oppressive. We had successfully uncovered the massive, highly illegal federal bribery and the deeply corrupted clinical safety data. But having the explosive evidence was only half of the actual battle. We were fighting against a massive, terrifying deadline. In less than 48 hours, Preston was scheduled to host a massive, highly publicized press conference at the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals corporate headquarters. Friday morning was the official deadline for the final shareholder approval vote and the formal live-streamed signing of the $10 billion merger. Because of the vicious fabricated hit piece he had aggressively planted in the Wall Street Journal that morning, his corporate stock was currently trading at an absolute all-time record high. The powerful board of directors was completely blinded by the massive sudden influx of market capital. They were fully prepared to blindly rubber stamp the historic merger and hand Preston total absolute victory. Maya paced slowly across the expensive Persian rug, holding her warm mug of dark coffee. She explained the harsh, brutal reality of the federal justice system. Even if we handed the explosive FDA bribery evidence directly to the federal authorities tonight, it would take them several agonizing months to formally investigate the complex financial trails and officially indict him. The massive, slow-moving bureaucratic machine would absolutely not move fast enough to stop the final shareholder vote on Friday morning. By the time the federal agents finally arrived with their heavy handcuffs, the $10 billion corporate merger would already be finalized and the massive offshore money would be completely laundered and permanently gone. I stared deeply at the bright, glowing screen of the silver laptop, absorbing the harsh, terrifying truth of her words. If we could not rely on the slow federal government to stop the massive corporate transaction in time, we had to completely destroy the deal from the absolute top down. We had to go directly to the only other person on the entire planet who possessed the absolute unilateral power to instantly kill the $10 billion merger before the ink even dried on the contract. We needed to directly contact the chief executive officer of the acquiring global multinational conglomerate. His name was Harrison Sterling, and he was a notoriously ruthless, brilliant billionaire investor who absolutely despised corporate liabilities and strictly refused to acquire any medical company with even a single trace of regulatory scandal. If Harrison Sterling signs that final contract on live television Friday morning, he is legally absorbing all of Preston, massive criminal liability. I said, my voice completely cold and intensely focused. He is a brilliant, careful man. He would absolutely never risk his own massive global empire to acquire a federally corrupted asset if he actually knew the dark truth. We need to tell him exactly what he is buying. Maya sat down heavily next to me on the soft leather sofa and vigorously rubbed her tired eyes. You cannot simply call a man like Harrison Sterling on his personal cellular phone. Elena, she cautioned, her tone heavy with realistic professional doubt. He is guarded by an absolute fortress of ruthless corporate lawyers and highly aggressive executive gatekeepers. If you send an email claiming to be Preston's crazy ex-wife, his private security team will instantly delete it as pathetic, desperate spam. They have all read the Wall Street Journal article today. They firmly believe you are a deeply disturbed extortionist. They will never let you anywhere near him. I smiled a very slow, highly dangerous and calculating smile. I am not going to contact him as the bitter, crazy ex-wife, I replied, my fingers lightly tracing the edge of the stolen encrypted digital drive. I am going to contact him as a highly classified anonymous corporate whistleblower who possesses the exact fatal structural anomaly that will completely destroy his $10 billion investment. I pulled my sleek tablet onto my lap and immediately opened a completely blank, heavily encrypted communication channel. I did not use any standard email formatting. I did not include any polite professional greetings. I needed to instantly bypass his massive administrative wall by triggering a massive internal corporate panic. I instructed Maya to completely mask my digital location routing the secure message through a complex labyrinth of untraceable international servers. Then I began to type the most important message of my entire life. To Harrison Sterling, you are currently scheduled to finalize the $10 billion acquisition of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals on Friday morning. You have been completely, legally blinded by a massive orchestrated corporate fraud. The core baseline intellectual property, known as Project Horizon, is currently locked under an active federal criminal investigation for fraudulent asset transfer. Furthermore, the primary clinical safety trials were heavily mathematically altered to hide a fatal, severe cardiac anomaly in 4% of all human test subjects. Preston Hayes successfully bribed a senior federal medical regulator $2 million to completely bypass the mandatory safety refinements. If you sign that massive contract on Friday, you will be legally absorbing a federally corrupted lethal asset that will completely destroy your entire global holding company. I stopped typing and looked over at Maya. She was watching the digital screen with intense, burning anticipation. Now we need the absolute, undeniable hook, I told her. I need to give him just enough raw toxic data to prove I am entirely legitimate without giving away the entire puzzle before I can look him dead in the eyes. I carefully extracted a single heavily redacted page from the locked clinical trial folders. It was the original raw medical datasheet showing the severe cardiac arrhythmias explicitly signed and personally dated by Preston before he illegally altered the numbers for the federal government. I attached the single devastating digital file to the secure anonymous message. I typed the final commanding sentences. Attached is a single page of the original unaltered clinical data. Cross-reference the hidden chemical sequence with your own private medical analyst tonight. When your scientists confirm the massive lethal anomaly, you will absolutely need to see the remaining comprehensive bribery documents. I will meet you in person this Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I will provide the specific secure location when you confirm you are ready to see the absolute truth. If you do not meet me, you will blindly buy a dying, corrupted company. Maya executed the final secure encryption protocol, and we hit the send button. The heavily masked message silently vanished into the digital ether, directly bypassing the standard corporate firewalls and landing straight into the highly restricted personal executive inbox of Harrison Sterling. The agonizing waiting game began. The dark, heavy hours dragged by with excruciating slowness. The massive grandfather clock ticked loudly, echoing through the completely silent brownstone. Midnight passed. Then, 1 o'clock in the morning. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the soft sofa, staring completely unblinking at the blank digital tablet screen. I refused to sleep. I refused to eat. My entire physical body was completely vibrating with pure, raw electric adrenaline. I was playing a massive, terrifying game of high-stakes corporate poker with two of the most powerful, wealthy billionaires in the country, and my only chips were a stolen black digital drive and my own fierce, brilliant mind. At exactly 2:45 in the morning, the digital tablet suddenly violently flashed with a bright, stark white notification. Maya instantly bolted entirely upright from the dark leather reclining chair across the room where she had been lightly dozing. She rushed over to the glass table as I blindly reached out with trembling fingers and tapped the encrypted notification icon. The return message from Harrison Sterling was incredibly brief, entirely devoid of any pleasantries, and absolutely terrifying in its sheer cold corporate efficiency. His message contained only 2 short sentences. My private medical analysts have successfully verified the chemical anomaly in your provided sample. Name the location for the Friday morning meeting. A massive, powerful wave of absolute pure triumph washed violently over my entire exhausted body. We had completely hooked the biggest, most dangerous shark in the entire ocean. Harrison Sterling was officially actively engaged. He was a ruthless, brilliant man who absolutely hated being played for a fool, and he now completely realized that Preston Hayes was trying to blindly sell him a massive, toxic legal nightmare. I need to pick a location that completely paralyzes Preston. I told Maya, my voice thick with dark, cold strategy. I need a place where I can easily trap him exactly when he feels the absolute most arrogant and untouchable. Maya smiled a slow, highly dangerous predator smile. Preston is hosting his massive live-streamed merger signing and final shareholder approval vote at the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals executive headquarters on Friday morning, she noted, pulling up the massive public corporate itinerary. He has invited hundreds of financial reporters, aggressive Wall Street analysts, and wealthy global investors to the main boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock. He expects Harrison Sterling to walk onto that massive stage, shake his hand under the bright flashing cameras, and sign the $10 billion document in front of the entire financial world. Then we are not going to a dark, quiet coffee shop or a secret anonymous hotel room, I stated, my eyes burning with intense, cold, absolute certainty. We are going straight into the belly of the absolute beast. We are going to the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals building, but we are not going to the public stage. I quickly typed my final secure response to the powerful billionaire CEO. To Harrison Sterling, we will meet this Friday morning at exactly 8:30, half an hour before the public livestream officially begins. Meet me in the private executive holding suite directly adjacent to the main public boardroom at Vanguard headquarters. Bring your top federal compliance lawyer. Do not alert Preston Hayes that you are speaking with me. You will have exactly 30 minutes to review the massive federal bribery documents before you must step onto that brightly lit stage. I hit send for the final time and completely powered down the digital tablet. The massive trap was now perfectly and flawlessly set. Preston was currently sleeping soundly in his massive expensive penthouse, utterly convinced he had successfully destroyed my entire life. He believed Friday morning was going to be the absolute greatest crowning achievement of his corrupt, empty existence. He had absolutely no idea that I had just secretly invited the Grim Reaper into his private boardroom. The countdown to his absolute total ruin had officially begun. We spent the remaining dark early morning hours meticulously organizing the massive stolen digital files. We perfectly sequenced the forged patent transfer documents, the explicit offshore banking routing numbers, and the horrifying federal bribery emails. I wanted the upcoming presentation to be completely surgical and absolutely undeniable. I wanted Harrison Sterling to see the massive, terrifying depth of the corporate rot within the very first 5 minutes of our private meeting. Maya printed crisp, heavy physical copies of the most damaging documents, neatly organizing them into a thick, sleek black leather binder. This binder was no longer just a simple collection of stolen corporate paperwork. It was a massive, fully loaded weapon aimed directly at the heart of my husband's massive corrupt empire. When the bright morning sun finally began to rise completely over the quiet Brooklyn skyline, casting a long, cold light through the reinforced library windows, I stood up and walked over to the tall antique mirror resting in the corner of the room. I stared deeply into my own reflection. The terrified, heartbroken, submissive housewife who had blindly signed that insulting post-nuptial agreement at the charity gala just 2 days ago was completely permanently gone. The woman looking back at me now had cold, sharp, calculating eyes and a posture forged entirely from pure, unbreakable steel. Preston had foolishly told me I was absolutely nothing without him. He was about to find out exactly what nothing truly looked like when it burned his entire world to the ground. The bright, blinding sunlight reflected sharply off the massive glass skyscrapers of the Manhattan Financial District. Inside the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals executive headquarters, the atmosphere was absolutely electric. Maya and I were standing silently in the shadows of the private executive holding suite located just down the hall from the main auditorium. We were staring intensely at the massive high-definition television monitor mounted on the wall, watching the live corporate broadcast of Preston's massive press conference. The grand auditorium was packed completely beyond its maximum capacity. Hundreds of aggressive financial reporters, wealthy global investors, and high-ranking Wall Street analysts were crammed into the plush velvet seats. The bright, violent flashes of heavy professional camera lenses exploded continuously across the massive room, illuminating the grand stage where my husband was currently basking in his manufactured absolute glory. Preston stood proudly behind a heavy, polished mahogany podium, looking exactly like the invincible billionaire king he firmly believed himself to be. He was wearing a dark, custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people earned in an entire year. His thick, dark hair was perfectly styled, and his arrogant jawline was set in a wide, triumphant smile. Standing just a few feet behind him, completely soaking up the blinding spotlight, was Madison. She was wearing a sleek designer crimson dress that tightly hugged her figure. She looked incredibly smug, her chin tilted upward as she surveyed the massive crowd of wealthy elites. She truly believed she had successfully stolen my entire life and was about to be officially crowned the new queen of a $10 billion pharmaceutical empire. Preston leaned forward and adjusted the thin silver microphone. The massive chaotic chatter in the auditorium instantly died down, replaced by a heavy, thick silence of pure anticipation. Preston cleared his throat, and his deep, charismatic voice echoed loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Good morning, everyone." Preston began, his tone dripping with absolute false humility and practiced corporate charm. Today marks a truly historic milestone, not just for Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, but for the entire global medical community. When I first conceptualized the Project Horizon neurostabilizer, I dreamed of a world where severe neurological disorders could be safely and effectively managed. Today, that massive dream becomes a permanent reality. Through our new $10 billion strategic partnership with the Sterling Global Conglomerate, we are going to distribute this miraculous chemical formula to every single corner of the earth. I stood in the quiet holding room, watching his arrogant face on the bright monitor, my fingernails digging deeply into the palms of my hands. He was standing on a massive global stage, taking absolute total credit for the brilliant scientific formula I had painstakingly developed in a dark university laboratory while he was out drinking with his wealthy friends. He was lying effortlessly to the entire world. Preston paused dramatically, placing his hands flat against the polished wood of the podium. He adopted a deeply serious, slightly pained expression, perfectly executing his fake victim routine for the hungry press. As many of you have read in the financial papers recently, getting to this beautiful moment has not been without significant, difficult personal challenges. Preston continued, his voice dropping into a somber, sympathetic register. We have faced massive, aggressive attempts at corporate extortion and deeply unfortunate public distractions from disturbed individuals who desperately wanted to derail this life-saving medical progress. But we refuse to yield. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals stands completely committed to scientific integrity and absolute corporate transparency. We will never allow baseless, malicious jealousy to stand in the way of global medical advancement. The massive crowd of reporters and investors erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. They completely bought his vicious lies. They were actively cheering for the brave billionaire who had successfully protected his brilliant company from his crazy, greedy ex-wife. Madison stepped forward and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, playing the role of the incredibly supportive, loyal partner. It was a sickening, perfectly choreographed theatrical performance designed to manipulate the stock market and completely destroy my public reputation. But the fake applause suddenly began to fade as a massive, heavy side door on the stage slowly opened. The entire room instantly held its collective breath. Walking out onto the brightly lit stage, flanked by two massive, intimidating corporate security guards, was Harrison Sterling. Harrison Sterling was a titan of the international financial industry. He was an older man with piercing, cold grey eyes, sharp, angular features, and an aura of absolute terrifying power that made even Preston look like a small, frightened child playing dress-up in his father's suit. Sterling did not smile. He did not wave to the flashing cameras. He walked with heavy, measured, purposeful strides directly toward the center of the stage. Following closely behind him was his top federal compliance lawyer, carrying a thick, heavy leather binder containing the final $10 billion merger contract. Preston immediately stepped away from the podium, his arrogant smile stretching even wider. He aggressively extended his right hand, eager to publicly welcome the powerful billionaire investor who was about to permanently cement his vast fortune. Sterling looked at Preston's extended hand for a long, uncomfortable second before finally accepting it, giving a brief, firm shake that lacked any genuine warmth. The federal compliance lawyer stepped forward and carefully placed the thick leather binder onto the polished mahogany podium. He slowly opened the heavy cover, revealing the crisp white legal pages of the massive acquisition agreement. The bright camera flashes exploded rapidly, creating a blinding strobe light effect across the massive stage. The financial world was eagerly watching, waiting for the historic signature that would finalize the most lucrative pharmaceutical buyout of the entire decade. Preston eagerly reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy custom gold fountain pen. He leaned over the podium, completely unable to hide his raw, desperate greed. He signed his name across the primary authorization line with rapid, violent strokes, legally surrendering the massive Vanguard pharmaceutical empire over to the Sterling global conglomerate. He then stood up straight and offered the shiny gold pen directly to Harrison Sterling. "It is an absolute honor to officially welcome you to the Vanguard family," Harrison Preston said, his voice booming loudly through the microphone. Harrison Sterling did not reach for the gold pen. He stood perfectly still, his cold grey eyes locked intensely onto Preston's face. The heavy silence in the massive auditorium suddenly shifted from excited anticipation to a deep, uncomfortable tension. The reporters lowered their heavy cameras, slightly sensing that something was fundamentally wrong with the heavily rehearsed corporate choreography. Sterling slowly reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket and pulled out his private, secure cellular phone. He deliberately looked down at the glowing digital screen. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was not checking a random text message. He was looking at the exact time. It was precisely 9:15 in the morning. He was giving his massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers exactly 15 minutes to independently verify the massive, horrifying cache of federal bribery documents and altered clinical trial data I had just handed him in the private executive suite. Preston's arrogant smile finally began to aggressively falter. The heavy gold pen trembled slightly in his extended hand. Harrison Preston asked, his voice tight with sudden hidden panic. "Is there a problem with the final contract? We have hundreds of investors waiting for the official confirmation." Sterling ignored him completely. He kept his cold eyes firmly locked onto the glowing screen of his phone. The massive auditorium was so completely silent that you could clearly hear the low mechanical hum of the heavy air conditioning units in the ceiling. Madison shifted her weight nervously, her crimson dress rustling loudly against the stage floor. She looked rapidly back and forth between Preston and the powerful billionaire investor, entirely unsure of what was happening. Suddenly, the phone in Sterling's hand vibrated sharply with a single loud chime. Sterling read the incoming message. His sharp jaw instantly clenched, tightening into a hard, dangerous line. He looked up from the screen and stared directly into Preston's eyes with a look of pure, unadulterated, absolute corporate disgust. It was the exact look a man gives to a highly venomous snake right before he crushes its head beneath his heavy boot. Sterling slowly reached out and completely ignored the heavy gold pen Preston was desperately offering him. Instead, he placed his large hand flat against the heavy cover of the leather binder. With a loud, sharp, echoing smack, he aggressively slammed the contract completely shut. The loud sound echoed violently through the silent auditorium like a massive gunshot. Preston physically flinched backward, his face instantly draining of all color. "Harrison, what are you doing?" he stammered, his charismatic voice completely shattering into high-pitched absolute panic. "You have to sign the document. The global markets are actively trading on this merger right now. You cannot just walk away from a $10 billion agreement on live television. Sterling stepped back from the polished mahogany podium, completely distancing himself from the toxic radioactive asset. He looked out at the massive sea of confused reporters and panicked investors. He did not lean into the microphone, but his deep, powerful voice carried easily across the tense room. "There will be absolutely no merger today," he stated, his words falling like heavy anvils onto the silent crowd. "The Sterling Global Conglomerate is immediately and permanently withdrawing our $10 billion acquisition offer for Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. We are completely severing all financial ties with this deeply corrupted entity, effective immediately." The entire auditorium violently erupted into absolute pure chaos. Hundreds of reporters instantly began screaming questions at the top of their lungs, fighting aggressively to get closer to the stage. Wall Street analysts were frantically pulling out their cellular phones, shouting desperate sell orders to their massive trading desks as the Vanguard corporate stock instantly began to violently freefall in real time. Preston completely lost his mind. He lunged forward aggressively, grabbing Sterling by the arm. "You cannot do this to me!" Preston screamed, completely abandoning his fake, calm billionaire persona. "We have a legally binding letter of intent. You are legally obligated to sign that contract. Why are you doing this?" Sterling forcefully ripped his arm away from Preston's desperate grasp. His cold grey eyes narrowed with lethal intensity. "I do not buy stolen, federally frozen assets, Preston," he growled, his voice dripping with pure venom. "And I absolutely do not do business with arrogant, desperate men who violently bribe federal officials to hide lethal cardiac anomalies in their fake clinical trials." Preston's entire body went completely rigid. His eyes widened in absolute sheer terror as the dark, horrifying reality of his total destruction finally crashed down upon him. He knew exactly what Sterling was talking about, and he knew there was only one person on the entire planet who possessed that specific, highly classified clinical data. In the private holding room, I turned to Maya and smiled. It was finally time. The heavy mahogany doors separating the private executive holding suite from the main auditorium felt incredibly thick and entirely impenetrable. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, carpeted hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of absolute chaos violently erupting on the other side of the wood. Harrison Sterling had just dropped the massive $10 billion bomb onto the stage, and the entire financial world was currently tearing itself completely apart. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs completely. I was not wearing a rumpled silk dress from a disastrous charity gala today. I was not wearing the soft pastel colors of a quiet, submissive homemaker. I was wearing a sharply tailored, dark charcoal gray suit, perfectly fitted to my frame. It was the exact type of expensive, heavy armor required for a massive corporate execution. My posture was completely rigid, my spine forged from absolute solid steel, and my heart was beating with a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. I was no longer the frightened victim hiding in a dark Brooklyn brownstone. I was the absolute, undeniable architect of this entire pharmaceutical empire, and I was finally coming to permanently reclaim my stolen throne. Standing directly to my right was Maya. She looked incredibly fierce, wearing a sleek black trench coat, her dark eyes burning with intense, bright anticipation. Standing directly behind us, forming a massive, impenetrable human wall, were 3 heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters spelling FBI aggressively printed across their broad chests. They were the elite financial crimes unit specifically dispatched by the federal judge to physically secure the massive corporate crime scene. They did not speak a single word. They simply waited for my absolute signal. I reached out with my right hand and placed my palm flat against the cool, polished brass handle of the heavy auditorium door. I looked over at Maya and gave a single sharp nod. I pushed the heavy doors completely open. The sheer volume of the massive room hit me instantly like a physical wave. Hundreds of panicked reporters were aggressively shouting over each other. Wall Street analysts were screaming frantic orders into their cellular phones. The bright, violent flashes of professional cameras were still exploding erratically across the massive stage where Preston was desperately trying to grab Harrison Sterling by the arm. But the moment the heavy door slammed loudly against the back wall, the chaotic atmosphere in the room began to rapidly and violently shift. It did not happen all at once. It started at the back of the massive auditorium where the junior reporters and camera operators were tightly packed together. One by one, they turned their heads to see who had just forcefully entered the restricted executive area. When they saw me flanked by Maya and the three massive federal agents, their shouting instantly died in their throats. The sudden heavy silence rapidly spread forward through the massive velvet seats, moving like a fast cold shadow, completely swallowing the room. The frantic screaming slowly faded into confused, panicked murmurs, and then finally into absolute dead, terrifying silence. The bright camera flashes abruptly stopped. The entire global financial press corps was completely frozen, staring in pure absolute shock at the woman they had just brutally crucified in the morning papers. I stepped forward onto the thick plush carpet of the main center aisle. The sharp, solid click of my leather heels echoed loudly throughout the completely silent auditorium. Maya walked perfectly in sync with me, her heavy combat boots providing a dark, rhythmic baseline to my approach. The three federal agents followed closely behind us, their heavy tactical boots thudding ominously against the floor. We walked slowly and deliberately straight down the absolute center of the massive room. The wealthy corporate investors and aggressive journalists instantly scrambled to get out of our way. They violently pushed themselves back into the velvet rows, physically parting like the Red Sea to give us a wide, clear path to the main stage. I did not look at a single one of them. I kept my chin tilted perfectly upward, my cold, sharp eyes locked firmly onto the brightly lit stage directly in front of me. I could feel the intense burning heat of hundreds of pairs of eyes staring completely through me. I could hear the rapid, frantic clicking of a few brave camera shutters, trying to capture the massive, unprecedented spectacle of the disgraced ex-wife walking confidently into the massive corporate bloodbath, accompanied by the federal government. As I approached the front row of the massive auditorium, my eyes finally locked onto Madison. She was still standing on the edge of the polished wooden stage, wearing her expensive crimson designer dress. The smug, arrogant, triumphant smile she had been wearing just 5 minutes ago had been completely wiped from her perfectly painted face. Her mouth was slightly open, and her dark eyes were completely wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. She stared at the bright yellow letters printed across the broad chests of the federal agents, and her entire body began to visibly, violently tremble. She took a slow, terrified step backward, completely abandoning her supportive pose next to Preston. She knew exactly why the federal government was walking down that aisle. She knew the Cayman Islands Shell Company was no longer a secret. I shifted my cold gaze away from the terrified mistress and looked directly at Harrison Sterling. The powerful billionaire CEO was standing tall and completely calm on the far side of the massive stage, perfectly separated from Preston. As I reached the front row and stopped at the base of the wooden stairs, Sterling looked directly into my eyes. He gave a single, incredibly slow and highly respectful nod of his grey head. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement between two brilliant strategic minds who had successfully completely outmaneuvered a massive corrupt predator. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what I was about to do. Finally, I looked at Preston. My billionaire husband was standing completely frozen behind the heavy mahogany podium, holding the expensive gold fountain pen in his trembling right hand. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit suddenly looked entirely too large for his shrinking, pathetic frame. The deep, charismatic tan on his face had completely vanished, leaving his skin looking sickly pale and covered in a thin, cold sweat. His brain was violently struggling to process the impossible visual information standing directly in front of him. In his arrogant, delusional mind, I was supposed to be completely broken, hiding under a blanket in a cheap, dark apartment, crying over the brutal Wall Street Journal article he had maliciously planted. I was absolutely not supposed to be standing in the center of his corporate stronghold, radiating absolute, pure, terrifying power and completely backed by the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The heavy, absolute silence stretched tightly across the massive room, feeling like a thick wire about to violently snap. Preston's chest heaved up and down as he desperately tried to force air into his panicked lungs. He looked at me, Then he looked at the massive federal agents, and then he looked out at the hundreds of silent, aggressive reporters actively watching his massive public humiliation. He realized in a sudden, terrifying flash that he was entirely losing complete control of his own highly orchestrated corporate narrative. He desperately needed to aggressively reassert his massive absolute dominance before the press realized the dark, horrifying truth. Preston forcefully gripped the edges of the polished mahogany podium, his knuckles turning completely white. He let out a loud, sudden, high-pitched burst of nervous, hollow laughter. The pathetic, desperate sound echoed terribly through the state-of-the-art sound system, causing a sharp, painful burst of electronic feedback to screech through the massive auditorium. "What is the meaning of this massive, ridiculous interruption?" Preston demanded, his charismatic voice cracking violently under the massive, immense pressure. He forced a wide, fake, condescending smile onto his pale, sweating face, violently pointing a shaking finger directly at me. He leaned heavily into the silver microphone, addressing the completely silent crowd of journalists. "Ladies and gentlemen, please completely ignore this highly unfortunate, pathetic spectacle," Preston announced loudly, his voice dripping with fake, arrogant sympathy. "As you all unfortunately read in the financial papers this morning, my ex-wife Elena is currently suffering from a massive, severe psychiatric episode. She's deeply unwell and completely prone to violent, paranoid delusions regarding my pharmaceutical company. She clearly hired these private security actors to illegally impersonate federal agents in a pathetic, desperate attempt to extort money from this massive corporate merger." Preston looked away from the silent crowd and violently, aggressively signaled to the massive Vanguard corporate security guards standing near the stage exits. "Security," Preston shouted aggressively, his fake calm completely shattering into raw, violent anger. "Remove this deeply disturbed, delusional woman from my corporate building immediately. Call the local city police and have her officially arrested for massive criminal trespassing and corporate espionage. Get her out of my sight right this very second." Two massive corporate security guards wearing dark tactical suits immediately stepped forward from the shadows, moving aggressively toward the front of the stage to physically execute his desperate orders. But they did not even make it 2 single steps. The 3 massive federal agents standing firmly behind me instantly and uniformly placed their heavy hands directly onto the heavy black holsters resting on their tactical belts. It was not a drawn weapon, but it was an absolute, undeniable physical promise of massive lethal force. The sharp, synchronized movement was incredibly loud in the dead silent room. The 2 corporate security guards instantly froze, completely terrified, raising their empty hands and rapidly backing away into the dark shadows, completely abandoning their billionaire boss. Preston stood completely alone behind the heavy wooden podium, entirely stripped of his massive corporate protection. His fake, arrogant smile completely collapsed. The heavy gold fountain pen violently slipped from his sweating fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished wood, rolling off the podium and dropping heavily onto the stage floor. He stared down at me, completely trapped, like a desperate, cornered animal, staring into the cold, dead eyes of an absolute apex predator. The entire global financial world was watching his massive empire violently crumble in real time, and he had absolutely nowhere left to run. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stage stairs, my expensive tailored suit completely flawless, my breathing entirely steady. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of human emotion. I simply prepared to deliver the absolute final fatal blow. I completely ignored Preston. He was standing there trembling and sweating profusely, but he no longer mattered to me. I walked right past his pathetic, shrinking frame and stepped directly up to the heavy, polished mahogany podium. The entire massive auditorium was holding its collective breath. I did not scream, and I absolutely did not cry. My heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic, cold precision. I reached into my dark leather bag and pulled out the small black encrypted sync drive we had used to clone his private life. Maya had already wirelessly bypassed the main Vanguard audiovisual system from her secure laptop sitting in the back of the room. I plugged the small device directly into the master presentation port built into the top of the heavy wooden podium. I tapped the glowing digital screen twice. Instantly, the massive state-of-the-art projection screen dominating the entire wall behind the stage violently flickered to life. The bright Vanguard corporate logo vanished into thin air. It was immediately replaced by a highly detailed, unredacted financial document glowing brightly for the entire financial world to see. I leaned perfectly forward into the silver microphone. My voice echoed with a dark, heavy certainty that commanded total obedience from every single person in the massive room. What you are currently looking at is the true foundational blueprint of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. I announced calmly to the silent crowd of aggressive journalists and wealthy corporate investors. For 6 long years, my billionaire husband told the global market that he was the sole brilliant creator of the Project Horizon neurostabilizer. That was a calculated, terrifying lie. I am a highly trained biochemist, and I personally developed the exact baseline molecular formula in my university laboratory, long before this corrupt pharmaceutical empire even existed. I tapped the podium console and projected the original time-stamped scientific patents directly onto the screen, clearly showing my legal maiden name registered as the primary and sole inventor. A collective gasp echoed through the plush velvet seats of the auditorium as hundreds of aggressive financial reporters frantically began typing the shocking revelation into their mobile devices. But Preston did not just steal the public credit for my entire life work. I continued, my voice cutting through the heavy, thick air like a sharpened steel blade. Last night, he deliberately executed a hostile federal fraud to steal the financial future of this medical breakthrough. I tapped the digital screen again, and the bright projected image shifted entirely to the highly confidential intellectual property transfer documents we had stolen directly from his secure executive server. I directed the undivided attention of the panicked crowd to the bold black signature resting at the very bottom of the glowing legal document. That is my exact handwriting, I explained to the shocked board members sitting frozen in the front row. But I did not sign that binding legal document. Preston meticulously forged my digital signature to illegally authorize the permanent transfer of the $10 billion medical patent completely out of our legally protected joint marital holding trust. He aggressively initiated this fraudulent transfer just hours before standing on this exact stage to blindly sell the stolen intellectual property to the sterling global conglomerate. He deliberately attempted to launder the baseline asset through a hidden Delaware dummy corporation to completely bypass federal financial oversight and personally steal the entire $10 billion payout for himself. The bright, heavy camera flashes violently exploded across the auditorium, once again capturing the undeniable digital proof of his federal corporate crimes. The wealthy Wall Street analysts were staring at the screen in pure, unadulterated horror, rapidly realizing their massive financial investments were built on a fragile, terrifying foundation of illegal forgeries and stolen scientific assets. But the corporate theft did not simply stop in the state of Delaware, I stated coldly, keeping my sharp eyes locked firmly onto a massive crowd of reporters. Preston desperately needed a highly secure hidden location to wash the stolen $10 billion payout clean before the federal auditors could ever find it. I tapped the presentation screen for the third time. The massive display violently shifted to reveal the highly classified Cayman Islands offshore banking statements we had successfully decrypted early this morning. I highlighted the specific international numeric routing number and the exact legal name of the hidden foreign shell company. The anonymous offshore corporate entity is legally registered as Apex Global Ventures. I announced loudly, ensuring every single reporter in the room captured the exact illegal financial details for their evening broadcasts. The sole registered financial beneficiary of this illegal offshore shell company is standing right here on this stage with us today. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at Madison. She was still frozen near the wooden stairs, her face drained of all human color. Madison is the Vanguard Vice President of Acquisitions, and she is also my husband's mistress, I revealed coldly to the entire listening world. She personally orchestrated the illegal offshore accounts to hide the stolen merger funds from the federal government. Madison panicked. The blinding spotlight of public ruin was now violently and permanently focused directly onto her. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was actively facing decades in a dark federal prison for international wire fraud and aggressive corporate conspiracy. She let out a high-pitched, terrified sob and aggressively hiked up the heavy silk fabric of her expensive crimson designer dress. She spun around violently, entirely abandoning her expensive high heels on the polished wooden stage, and desperately tried to sprint toward the heavy side exit doors. She did not even make it 5 feet across the stage. Maya gave a single sharp physical signal, and 2 of the massive federal agents instantly lunged forward from the dark shadows. They moved with terrifying, calculated precision. The heavy agents intercepted Madison, grabbing her bare arms and forcefully pinning her violently against the solid brick wall of the stage wing. Madison screamed frantically, thrashing her entire body from side to side, but the highly trained federal agents easily subdued her physically, forcing her arms behind her back and securing heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The aggressive financial press violently documented every single second of her pathetic public arrest, their professional cameras capturing her total, absolute destruction. I completely ignored the chaotic, violent struggle happening in the dark shadows of the stage and turned my attention back to the silver microphone. The financial theft and the highly illegal offshore accounts are absolutely enough to send Preston to a federal prison for the rest of his natural life. I continued, my voice rising slightly to completely dominate the ambient noise of the terrified room. But his absolute worst crime was not committed against me or his wealthy corporate board. It was aggressively and maliciously committed against every single innocent sick patient currently relying on his fraudulent pharmaceutical medication. The entire massive auditorium fell dead silent once again. The aggressive reporters entirely stopped shouting, and the wealthy corporate investors froze in their expensive velvet seats. I tapped the bright digital screen one final time, projecting the most radioactive, toxic evidence we had successfully uncovered in the dark hours of the morning. The massive display was instantly filled with the heavily redacted federal clinical trial data and the highly classified internal emails sent directly between Preston and the corrupt medical regulators in Washington. When I originally created the Project Horizon formula, I explicitly documented a massive lethal side effect. I explained clearly to the horrified crowd of investors. The raw, unrefined chemical compound actively causes severe irregular cardiac arrhythmias in 4% of all human test subjects. The baseline drug absolutely required years of dedicated laboratory refinement before it could ever be considered completely safe for public medical consumption. But Preston did not want to wait for the slow, methodical, scientific process. He desperately needed the massive financial validation of a successful medical launch to artificially inflate his corporate stock valuation before this $10 billion merger. I pointed a steady, confident finger directly at the glowing digital emails displayed on the massive screen. He deliberately altered the official federal safety reports. He completely erased the lethal cardiac anomaly from the public medical record. And to strictly guarantee the massive, horrifying fraud remained hidden, he secretly wired a massive $2 million bribe to a senior federal medical official to aggressively fast-track the highly dangerous drug directly onto the open public market. The massive, horrifying revelation hit the packed auditorium like a devastating physical earthquake. The wealthy corporate investors began to violently shout in pure, unadulterated rage and absolute sheer panic. They were actively pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a pharmaceutical company that was currently distributing a highly lethal, federally corrupted drug to innocent people. The massive legal liability was completely astronomical. It was an absolute corporate death sentence. Harrison Sterling, who had been standing silently near the far side of the stage, listening intensely to every single terrifying word, stepped completely forward into the bright light. He looked out at the massive, chaotic crowd of screaming reporters and enraged Wall Street analysts. I am officially publicly confirming that the Sterling Global conglomerate is permanently canceling this entire acquisition, he announced, his deep, powerful voice crushing any remaining tiny shred of hope Preston had left in his pathetic body. We will actively cooperate with the federal authorities to investigate this massive, disgusting medical fraud. Sterling gave me one final, highly respectful nod before turning his back on the completely ruined Vanguard empire and walking briskly off the stage, surrounded by his team of aggressive corporate lawyers. I slowly turned away from the silver microphone and looked directly at Preston. He was shattered into a million tiny jagged pieces. The charismatic, invincible billionaire husband was permanently gone, completely replaced by a pathetic, broken, terrified shell of a man. The corporate stock of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals was currently violently crashing to absolute zero on the digital trading monitors mounted in the back of the room. His highly expensive corporate lawyers were actively fleeing the building to desperately avoid federal criminal indictment. His mistress was standing in heavy steel handcuffs in the dark corner of the stage, weeping uncontrollably. His $10 billion merger was completely, permanently dead. I slowly closed the physical distance between us, walking deliberately until I was standing just inches away from his sweating, violently shaking face. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving violently as he desperately struggled to breathe the heavy, conditioned air. He finally realized the massive, terrifying scale of the total destruction I had meticulously, flawlessly orchestrated. "You said I was nothing without you," I said, my voice cold and entirely devoid of any human mercy. I made sure my exact words carried clearly over the chaotic noise of the violently collapsing room. "But this entire empire is built entirely on my formula, and you just sold a fraudulent FDA-bribed asset to a federal buyer." Preston's physical body violently gave out entirely. His weak, trembling knees buckled completely beneath his expensive Italian suit, and he collapsed heavily onto the hard-polished wooden floor of the stage. He landed directly at my expensive leather heels, violently crushing the gold fountain pen he had dropped earlier. He looked up at me from the hard ground, tears streaming aggressively down his pale, ruined face. He reached out with shaking, clammy hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my tailored suit jacket. "Elena, please," he sobbed hysterically, his voice completely pathetic and broken. "Please, stop the presentation. Please tell them it is a mistake. I will give you anything you want. I will give you the entire company. Please do not do this to me." I looked down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling in the bright flashing lights of the global press. The federal agents were already walking aggressively across the stage, pulling out their heavy steel handcuffs to finally arrest him for his massive federal crimes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. I simply looked deep into his terrified, sobbing eyes and delivered the final absolute truth, too late. Preston remained kneeling on the hard wooden floor of the stage, his expensive custom Italian suit soaking up the cold sweat pouring from his completely pale face. The two massive federal agents grabbed his trembling arms and forcefully hauled him to his feet, completely ignoring his pathetic, high-pitched sobbing. The blinding camera flashes from the hundreds of aggressive financial reporters continued to explode violently across the massive auditorium, capturing every single humiliating second of his total destruction. The once charismatic, invincible billionaire was now stumbling blindly, unable to even support his own physical weight. I stood perfectly still, with my arms crossed over my chest, watching with cold, absolute satisfaction as the agents aggressively marched him off the bright stage and pushed him roughly through the heavy side exit doors, his expensive shoes dragging uselessly against the floor. The massive crowd of journalists instantly surged forward, knocking over heavy velvet chairs and abandoning their expensive recording equipment in a desperate, violent rush to follow the massive arrests. Maya stood firmly by my side, her dark eyes watching the chaotic stampede with a sharp, predatory smile. We followed closely behind the massive wave of aggressive reporters stepping out of the dark, stifling auditorium and into the massive, bright glass atrium of the Vanguard Pharmaceuticals grand lobby. The massive corporate lobby was completely bathed in bright morning sunlight, streaming through the towering glass walls, but the atmosphere was darker and more suffocating than a concrete prison cell. As the federal agents pushed Preston toward the heavy revolving front doors, the harsh, terrifying reality of his permanent, absolute ruin finally completely shattered his delusional mind. The massive, heavy steel doors of a federal penitentiary were swinging wide open to swallow him whole, and his selfish, desperate survival instincts violently kicked in. He frantically dug his expensive leather heels into the polished marble floor, aggressively resisting the heavy pull of the federal agents. He violently twisted his body around, frantically scanning the chaotic, crowded lobby until his terrified eyes locked onto Madison. She was being firmly escorted by two different federal agents, her expensive crimson designer dress torn and her mascara running darkly down her pale, terrified face. Preston raised his shaking hand and aggressively pointed his finger directly at the woman he had falsely claimed was his true intellectual equal. It was her. Preston screamed, his voice echoing loudly off the high-glass ceilings, completely drowning out the chaotic shouting of the aggressive press. She did it all, he lied frantically, his eyes wide with pure, desperate madness. Madison manipulated the entire offshore financial structure. She secretly opened the Cayman Islands shell company without my explicit knowledge. She was the one who personally wired the $2 million massive bribe to the federal medical regulators. I am completely innocent. She aggressively orchestrated the entire corporate fraud to steal my pharmaceutical company. The entire massive crowded lobby fell into a sudden, heavy, shocked silence. The aggressive financial reporters eagerly pointed their heavy microphones and bright camera lenses directly toward the ruined mistress, actively recording the absolute ultimate corporate betrayal. Madison stopped struggling against the strong grip of her arresting agents and stared at Preston with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The man who had promised her a $10 billion empire and a luxury penthouse was now actively begging the federal government to lock her in a dark cage for the rest of her natural life just to save his own pathetic skin. The terrifying realization violently snapped whatever tiny shred of loyalty she had left in her cold, calculating heart. She did not cry, and she absolutely did not cower. Madison threw her head back and let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like violently shattering glass. "You pathetic, weak coward!" Madison screamed back, her high-pitched voice violently tearing through the tense, silent lobby. "I am not going to let you pin your massive, disgusting federal crimes on me." She violently twisted her head to look directly at the senior federal agent standing tightly holding her arm. "I want full, absolute federal immunity," Madison announced loudly, ensuring every single journalist in the massive room recorded her exact legal demand. "I will officially turn state's evidence against Preston Hayes right this very second. I have thousands of highly classified encrypted audio recordings proving he personally ordered the massive medical bribery. I know the exact digital combinations to his private hidden safes, and I can easily provide the original unredacted communications, proving he meticulously planned to illegally steal his wife baseline formula for the last 2 years. I will give you every single piece of his massive, corrupt criminal empire on a silver platter if you cut me a binding legal deal right here today." Preston completely stopped fighting the agents. His physical body went entirely slack, completely paralyzed by the massive, overwhelming weight of his own profound, absolute stupidity. He had just brutally, publicly betrayed the exact single person who held all the remaining keys to his dark, hidden closets. His highly expensive corporate defense strategy had relied entirely on blaming a rogue subordinate, but Madison had just successfully publicly detonated that legal defense before he even reached the police car. The senior federal agent standing next to Preston did not show a single ounce of emotion. He forcefully grabbed Preston's right wrist, violently twisting it behind his expensive suit jacket. The sharp, loud metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly into place echoed with beautiful, terrifying finality across the massive marble lobby. Preston let out a low, agonizing moan, staring blankly down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. The aggressive journalists instantly swarmed closer violently, shouting their final brutal questions as the federal agents forcefully pushed the ruined billionaire toward the heavy glass doors. His massive pharmaceutical empire was completely, permanently gone. His pristine public reputation was entirely violently destroyed. His personal, boundless wealth was officially frozen under massive federal indictment. I stood quietly near the heavy mahogany auditorium doors, standing shoulder to shoulder with Maya, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the massive police convoy, actively waiting outside the glass building. It had taken Preston 6 long, agonizing years of meticulous lies, vicious emotional manipulation, and massive calculated fraud to build his $10 billion medical empire. He had coldly told me I was absolutely nothing without him completely believing his massive unearned power made him entirely untouchable. But standing in the bright sunlight of his own massive corporate lobby, he had lost absolutely everything he valued in the entire world in a span of exactly 5 short, terrifying minutes. The heavy glass doors finally slid shut behind him, sealing his dark, permanent fate. The chaotic crowd of reporters violently pushed through the exits, desperately chasing the police cars, leaving the massive marble lobby completely empty and beautifully entirely silent. Maya turned to me and offered a slow, deeply satisfied smile. The massive air in the room felt incredibly light and completely pure for the very first time in 6 years. I took a slow, deep breath, completely letting go of the heavy, toxic past. The absolute brutal architect of my suffering was finally locked in heavy iron chains, and I was completely ready to build my own beautiful future. 3 months later, the brutal, harsh reality of the federal justice system had completely and entirely consumed my former husband. Preston was currently sitting in a cold, damp 6 by 8 foot concrete cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. The arrogant billionaire who used to throw violently expensive crystal glasses against penthouse walls when his morning espresso was slightly too cold was now sleeping on a thin, heavily stained plastic mattress. Last Tuesday, the federal judge overseeing his massive corporate fraud case formally and officially denied his final petition for bail. The prosecuting attorney successfully argued that a man who was willing and entirely capable of secretly wiring $2 million to bribe a senior government official was an extreme, massive flight risk. All of his personal and corporate assets were completely frozen and heavily seized by the federal government under the strict federal racketeering laws. He had absolutely zero money left to hire the elite miracle-working defense lawyers he desperately needed. Instead, he was forced to rely on a heavily overworked public defender who strongly advised him to take a massive 30-year plea deal. He spent his long, dark, pathetic days pacing the narrow concrete floor, completely losing his mind, as he desperately tried to comprehend how the quiet, submissive housewife he had so aggressively underestimated had successfully orchestrated his total, absolute annihilation. Madison was faring even worse. She was currently being held in a highly secure regional facility, awaiting her own massive federal trial. Her desperate, frantic attempt to turn state evidence against Preston had entirely backfired when the ruthless federal prosecutors discovered she had actively tried to secretly delete key digital banking documents just hours before her dramatic public arrest in the corporate lobby. The federal judge absolutely threw the heavy legal book at her, entirely denying her immunity deal and charging her with massive severe evidence, tampering on top of the massive international wire fraud. They were both completely ruined, permanently trapped in the massive, terrifying steel cage they had arrogantly built with their own greedy hands. With Preston locked completely away in the dark, I systematically turned my intense focus toward the massive, rotting carcass of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. As the legally recognized sole creator of the foundational intellectual property, I had successfully petitioned the federal commercial courts to grant me total, absolute emergency receivership over the violently collapsing company. I did not want to save his corrupt empire. I wanted to completely and entirely erase it from the face of the earth. I spent the first 2 months ruthlessly liquidating his massive corporate assets. I sold off the expensive private executive jets, the heavily armored black luxury vehicles, and the absurdly lavish corporate retreat properties scattered across the country. I took immense, profound pleasure in personally signing the official legal documents that permanently terminated the expensive lease on the massive glass headquarters in the financial district. I stood on the busy Manhattan sidewalk and actively watched as heavy construction crews forcefully pried the massive silver Vanguard letters off the side of the towering skyscraper. The loud screeching sound of the heavy metal violently scraping against the expensive glass was the absolute most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the beautiful sound of pure, undeniable justice. I completely dissolved the corrupt corporate entity, scattering its broken ashes into the cold wind, ensuring that Preston would never again be mentioned in the respected medical community without the massive, heavy stain of federal criminal fraud permanently attached to his ruined name. But I did not destroy his massive empire just to leave a dark, empty void in the medical community. I tore down his deeply corrupted house so I could successfully build an absolute fortress on my own pristine foundation. Using the massive recovered funds from the liquidated corporate assets and the full legal restoration of my original scientific patents, I officially launched my own private research holding company. I named it Horizon Medical Innovations. We were not going to prioritize massive greedy billionaire profits or artificially inflated global stock valuations. We were going to prioritize absolute pure scientific integrity and the actual physical safety of the human beings who desperately needed our help. I immediately pulled the dangerous, unrefined neurostabilizer completely off the public market, preventing any further lethal cardiac anomalies from destroying innocent families. I aggressively hired a brand new massive team of the most brilliant ethical biochemists in the entire country, and we went directly back into the sterile, bright laboratories. We were going to spend the next 2 years doing the exact, hard, rigorous scientific work Preston had completely refused to do. We were going to perfectly refine the baseline formula and completely eliminate the dangerous side effects before we ever sold a single medical dose. I absolutely knew that building a massive ethical medical empire in the cutthroat modern American corporate landscape required incredible ruthless protection. I needed an absolute shark guarding the massive iron gates of my new company. There was only one single person in the entire world I completely trusted to hold that immense, terrifying power. I officially installed my fierce, brilliant sister-in-law, Maya, as the chief legal officer and second in command of Horizon Medical Innovations. She permanently closed her private forensic accounting firm in Brooklyn and moved directly into the massive, beautiful corner office right next to mine. She completely redesigned our entire corporate compliance structure, making it absolutely mathematically impossible for anyone to ever hide a single stolen penny or forge a single digital signature inside our new building. Maya heavily vetted every single new employee, every single corporate vendor, and every single laboratory technician with a terrifying cold precision. She built a massive, impenetrable legal fortress around my brilliant scientific mind. Together, we were an entirely unbreakable, massive force of nature. I was the brilliant scientific architect who designed the future, and she was the ruthless legal executioner who violently slaughtered anyone who dared to threaten our massive progress. Walking through the pristine, bright glass corridors of our new corporate headquarters, I felt a profound, massive wave of absolute peace completely wash over my soul. We had successfully taken the absolute darkest, most terrifying moment of my entire life and violently transformed it into a massive, brilliant beacon of undeniable power. I was no longer a silent, invisible ghost haunting the dark background of a stolen life. I was finally exactly where I belonged. The afternoon sun began its slow, beautiful descent behind the massive, glittering steel skyscrapers of the Manhattan skyline, casting a warm golden light across the polished hardwood floor of my brand new corner office. I stood perfectly still by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, holding a warm cup of herbal tea in my hands. The thick, heavy silence in this beautiful room was absolutely nothing like the terrifying, oppressive silence I used to feel walking through Preston's expensive, empty penthouse. This was a profound, heavy peace. This was the beautiful, quiet sound of total, absolute freedom. I looked down at the bustling city streets far below, watching the tiny yellow taxicabs and the massive crowds of people moving rapidly through the dense concrete canyons. Just a few short months ago, I was completely terrified walking those exact same streets, believing I had absolutely nothing left to my name but a single suitcase and a shattered, broken heart. I had genuinely believed the vicious, cruel lies my billionaire husband had repeatedly, aggressively hammered into my mind. He had looked me dead in the eyes and confidently told me I was absolutely nothing without him. He genuinely thought that because I had willingly, quietly traded my white laboratory coat for a quiet domestic life, I had somehow permanently surrendered my brilliant mind and my inherent personal power. He was so deeply, profoundly wrong. As I stood there, absorbing the magnificent golden light of the fading New York sun, I finally completely understood the massive truth. Preston never actually possessed any real power of his own. He was nothing but an incredibly arrogant, empty vessel, a pathetic, fragile shell of a man who desperately relied entirely on the massive, brilliant foundation I had painstakingly poured for him. I had willingly, generously allowed him to borrow my immense power because I genuinely, deeply loved him, and I wanted to see him succeed. But the fatal, massive mistake he made was blindly confusing my quiet, generous sacrifice with pathetic, permanent weakness. He completely forgot that the architect who meticulously draws the incredibly complex blueprints for a massive towering skyscraper also fundamentally knows exactly where to place the explosive charges to bring the entire massive structure violently crashing down into a pile of broken, smoking rubble. He thought he could easily discard me the moment he secured his massive, fraudulent $10 billion merger. He thought I would simply fade away into the dark shadows and let his arrogant mistress wear my family jewels. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the crisp, clean air fill my lungs completely. I gently placed my warm ceramic mug onto the edge of my massive, heavy oak desk. Resting perfectly on the pristine leather desk pad was a thick stack of newly printed, highly complex biochemical research proposals, eagerly waiting for my direct final approval. Maya had just dropped them off perfectly organized and completely legally airtight. We were actively building a magnificent ethical medical empire that was going to completely change the world for the better. The dark, toxic ghost of Vanguard Pharmaceuticals was permanently, completely erased from my life. Preston was currently sitting in a cold, dark concrete federal cell, completely forgotten by the massive, glittering financial world he had so desperately worshipped. I lightly traced my fingers across the smooth, polished surface of my heavy wooden desk, feeling the solid, absolute reality of my massive victory. I had successfully reclaimed my brilliant scientific career, my vast personal wealth, and my stolen family legacy. My grandmother's priceless vintage diamond choker, the exact same beautiful necklace Madison had so arrogantly flaunted at the charity gala, was currently resting completely safe and perfectly secure inside my heavy steel private bank vault. The precious family heirloom was finally completely cleansed of their disgusting, cheap betrayal. I turned completely away from the massive bright windows and looked deeply into the reflection of the heavy glass doors of my executive office. I did not see a frightened, broken victim staring back at me. I saw a brilliant, powerful, deeply resilient, strong woman who had successfully walked straight through a massive, terrifying, raging inferno and emerged completely and entirely physically unscathed. I had successfully survived the massive, brutal personal betrayal, and I had completely and actively conquered the ruthless, corrupt billionaire who violently tried to destroy my good name forever. Never let anyone convince you that your quiet sacrifices make you weak. A foundation does not make noise, but without it, the whole house collapses. If you loved watching Preston lose it all, give this a like and subscribe. It is 8 p.m. here in New York. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done with the necklace? Let me know down in the comments.